I rode out with over 500 cavalry across the snowy plains and reached Riftwind Fortress No. 2 by sunset. Bear 2 came out to greet me, surprised I'd shown up. I asked about the orcs. He said nothing had happened for over a month since the last battle. He hadn't even sent scouts. I scolded him for getting lazy after his promotion tonight. Walls and cold weather mean nothing to a determined enemy willing to sacrifice. Then I went to inspect the wall he'd built across the canyon mouth. 1 month of work, and it was only 10 meters high. I had 2 soldiers climb it easily to prove my point. It wouldn't stop anything. Bear 2 tried to explain that the frozen ground made quarrying stone nearly impossible, and I believed him. So I suggested a different approach. Pack snow onto the wall and pour water over it to freeze it solid. Snow was everywhere, and ice could be harder than stone. He jumped on the idea immediately. 10,000 workers started piling snow and freezing it with water. The wall grew fast. I watched from the fortress, waiting for the wolf men I expected to attack, but they never came. Then part of the wall collapsed with a loud crash, ruining half a night's work. Bear 2 figured out the snow hadn't been properly soaked and had it fixed. Still no orcs. I was puzzled, until intelligence came flooding into my mind. 100 wolfmen had been hiding in the snow beneath the wall, waiting to sneak attack. When the wall collapsed, the ice and snow buried them. They stayed put to avoid being discovered, but meltwater seeped in and froze them solid. At dawn, an orc commander named Maneo got tired of waiting for the wolfmen's signal and ordered 2,000 orc soldiers to charge the wall anyway. Their leader, Kuei-lun, was furious when everything failed. The wolfmen frozen, most of the 2,000 soldiers killed or frostbitten. He executed Maneo and sent magic eagles over the Black Mountains to scout my forces. I laughed at the luck of it all. I told Luke to leave a squadron on watch, especially right before dawn, and reminded Bear 2 to pour more water on the canyon side of the wall to make it steeper and slicker. I went back to sleep. Sometime later, I heard distant battle cries, the orcs attacking the ice wall with at least 1,000 troops. I didn't bother going to help. Bear 2 needed a chance to prove himself. By morning, it was over. Bear 2 reported they'd killed 300 or 400 orcs. The enemy couldn't stand on the ice, couldn't run away, and got frozen in place while our soldiers shot arrows from above. I warned him not to get overconfident. The orcs were desperate. They needed to break through before spring, when they'd face a full siege. They'd keep coming. Winter cold doesn't stop orcs. Hunger does, and they couldn't afford to wait. Bear 2 asked about taking prisoners from the buried wolfmen. I looked out at the snow for a long time, then sighed. They were fighting for survival too, in their own way. That took courage. We should respect our enemy and grant them a proper death. Bear 2 understood and headed for the wall. Through my intelligence network, I learned what happened on the orc side after their failed attack. Their leader, Kuei-lun, was already sitting in Red Maple City's hall before dawn. His lieutenant Azage dragged in Maneo, the commander who'd launched the reckless assault on my ice wall. Maneo tried to defend himself, blaming the wolfmen for not attacking on schedule. Azage explained that an avalanche had buried the wolfmen right where they'd been hiding. They were all dead. Then he kicked Maneo around the room, furious that the fool had sent warriors climbing an ice-covered wall where they couldn't even reach the top before being slaughtered. Their bodies had piled up and frozen together at the base. Kuei-lun called in all his tribal leaders. He gave Maneo one last meal, a leg of lamb. Maneo ate it crying, knowing what came next. Then Kuei-lun cut off his head and had it displayed to every tribe as a warning. Afterward, Kuei-lun sent his magic eagle west to scout my forces. But it was his priest, Sahalian, who delivered the real blow. Sahalian had sent his own creature, a death bird that could sense energy at night, to survey my side of the canyon. It reported over 3,000 trained soldiers with energy signatures, including 500 full knights. Kuei-lun was shaken. He asked why I wasn't attacking if I had that many. Sahalian explained that the human nobles above me would prefer us to wear each other down so they could swoop in later. I wasn't loyal to the Grand Duke, but that didn't mean I could be bought either. My defensive posture, the wall in Riftwind Canyon, troops stationed at Northwind City, showed I didn't want to fight right now. Kuei-lun, stubborn as he was, still suggested sending Sahalian to negotiate with me. He even fantasized about making me swear loyalty to him. Sahalian had to remind him bluntly, we weren't the strong side anymore. My forces alone could defeat them without waiting for any human alliance army. The question wasn't how to make me submit. It was how to keep me from attacking. That hit Kuei Luan hard. He stood there staring at the sky for a long time, then finally sighed. Sahalian advised him to retreat into the mountains, wait for the magic tide to rise further, build up more extraordinary warriors, and come back another day. In the end, Kuei Luan agreed to let Sahalian come meet me, to see what kind of person I really was. From my intelligence, I learned the orc's priest Sahalian tried to deliver a letter to us. He sent a servant carrying a sheepskin scroll toward the wall, but my guards didn't hesitate. They shot him dead with a crossbow bolt before he got close. Sahalian watched from around the canyon corner, shaken. He muttered that they didn't even give the messenger a chance to speak. I also learned that Sahalian was deeply worried. He feared the human mages to the south might seal off the orcs' last escape route with forbidden magic. If that happened, they'd be trapped completely. He told Azij he didn't believe in this war anymore. He planned to take the priests back into the mountains after negotiations and build ships to sail away. Azij even asked him to take 200 of his tribesmen along, to give them a way to survive. Sahalian wrote another letter, sealed it in a bamboo tube, and sent his deathbird to deliver it. The little creature flew over the wall and dropped the tube in front of one of my soldiers. The tube passed up the chain, soldier to squad leader to company leader to Luke, before reaching me on the wall. I was watching the orc magic eagle circling overhead. I let it look. The more it saw of my defenses, the less they'd dare to attack. The letter was written in common tongue. The orcs offered to stop fighting. As a show of good faith, they'd give us 10,000 young slaves and 200 carts of supplies. Luke seemed tempted, but I shook my head. None of those promises could actually be delivered. Think about it. How would 10,000 slaves and 200 carts get to us? We'd have to tear down the wall. And the moment we did that, the orcs would attack with everything they had. We'd won both fights so far because of our position. Throwing that away for some bait would be suicide. Luke said the orcs were suing for peace, so surely they'd keep their word. I told him not to let greed cloud his judgment. I dictated a reply. Forget the slaves and supplies, send magic materials instead. Deliver them first, and we'd discuss everything else later. That way I could test their sincerity without giving up anything. The reply went back by way of the death bird. A soldier held up the bamboo tube for the bird to see, set it on the ground, and walked away. The bird swooped down, grabbed it, and vanished into the evening sky. I watched it go with a cold smile. Did they really think I couldn't see through this? Offering gifts that require me to tear down my own wall. That's the Golden Ox stratagem, straight out of ancient history, how Qin destroyed Ba and Shu. And the idea that accepting orc gifts might turn other human nobles against me. A clumsy attempt at a sowing discord scheme. But that only works if someone's foolish enough to betray their own kind to serve orcs. Once spring comes and I march against them, any so-called peace offer just proves the orcs were desperate and begging. I watched the ice wall grow thicker and smiled. Let the orcs try whatever they wanted. Through my intelligence, I learned everything happening on their side. Kuei Luan came to see Sahalian that night, demanding to know if I'd agreed to their offer. Sahalian explained that his messenger had been shot dead before even reaching the wall, so he'd sent the letter by Deathbird instead. Then Kuei Luan revealed his plan. He wanted to raise the offer, 10,000 slaves and hundreds of carts of supplies. The trick was simple. To receive that many people and goods, I'd have to tear down the wall. The moment I did, his forces would rush in behind the slaves and attack. And if I refused to tear it down, then he'd drive those 10,000 slaves straight at the wall as a human battering ram. Kuei Luan had new confidence too. His hunter Barla had captured a live iron-armored pig, a magical beast with skin tough as metal. He planned to brew beast transformation potions from it. A squad of pigmen would have monstrous strength and nearly impenetrable hide, enough to smash through any wall or fortress. Then my reply arrived by Deathbird. Just a few words. Send magic materials instead. Kuei Luan was furious. I hadn't taken the bait at all. He crushed the letter underfoot and changed tactics. He ordered Sahalian to meet me in person 3 days from now, carrying treasures I supposedly couldn't refuse. And once I let my guard down, Sahalian was to kill me. Without a leader, Kuei Luan figured my knights would scatter. Sahalian accepted, knowing it was likely a suicide mission. He asked what treasures he'd be bringing. Kuei Luan produced 2 wooden boxes. The first held a suit of mithril magic armor, silver plates covered in runes, set with gemstones. Beautiful, but damaged. As long as nobody put it on, the defect wouldn't show. The second box held something far more valuable, a dragonmouth flower nurturing a spirit insect inside one of its buds. The plant's roots had been damaged by the iron-armored pig, but the spirit creature was still alive. For any human, a wood sprite was a priceless treasure. The plan was layered. The spirit insect would lure me into agreeing to meet. Then the mithril armor would dazzle me and lower my guard. And when I reached for it, Sahalian would strike. They both nodded and said the same words. All for the tribe. That night, the deathbird dropped another bamboo tube at my camp gate. The letter inside offered to meet in person and listed the treasures they'd bring, including a wood sprite. My men were confused about why the orcs were being so generous. I told Luke to reply. I'd agree to meet, but first they had to send the wood sprite to me as proof. If they could deliver letters by bird, they could deliver the sprite the same way. Otherwise, no meeting. Bear 2 asked why I'd agree to meet if I knew the orcs had bad intentions. I pointed out the obvious. There was a wall of ice dozens of meters thick between us. Could they fly over it? Let them come. They couldn't touch me. I told him to prepare. In 3 days, the orcs would definitely attack. That night, intelligence flooded into my mind. The Rain Duchy's Magic Academy had informed Grand Duke Stein about the rising magic tide. He was already planning to expand his armies and launch a spring offensive to seize resources from the Orc Mountains. The orcs had found an iron-armored pig and a dragonmouth flower with a spirit insect inside. The pig had damaged the plant's roots, and the spirit creature was dying. Kuei Luan planned to lure me into tearing down the wall with slaves and supplies, while Sahalian would try to assassinate me during our meeting. The bait, the dying spirit insect, and a broken mithril armor set. The spirit insect would arrive before dawn. The orcs were also sacrificing magic wolves to make 500 wolf transformation potions and developing pigman potions. They'd attack in 3 days regardless of what I did. But the best intelligence was this. If I absorbed the dragonmouth flower into my soul vessel's ecosystem and nourished it with life essence, I could save the spirit insect. And during the refining process, the wood element energy feeding back into me would sprout my battle chi seed, pushing me to Silver Knight. I laughed out loud. These orcs were doing me a huge favor without knowing it. Before dawn, 2 attendants brought in a small wooden box chained shut. Inside lay the dragonmouth flower, wilted, roots torn, barely alive. The largest bud was swollen and ready to burst, holding the spirit insect inside. I grabbed the plant and pulled it into my soul vessel's ecosystem. Life essence poured in from every direction, green energy flooding the broken roots. New root tendrils grew instantly, digging into the soil. The plant came back to life. Then the refining array activated. Golden patterns wrapped around every leaf and root. The flower shook violently as wood element energy drained from it, all rushing into that largest bud. The rest of the plant withered away until only a bare stem remained, holding one enormous glowing bud. The bud cracked open. A tiny green head poked out, 2 shiny black eyes looking around, frightened and confused. The golden array bound the little sprite, and I felt its consciousness connecting to mine through the formation. I could sense its weakness, its fear, and a small flicker of trust toward me. I kept feeding it life essence while the array extracted wood element energy, stamped it with my life signature, and channeled it into my battle chi seed. The seed trembled, then cracked. One crack after another spread across its shell until 2 tiny sprouts, one red, one blue, pushed through. A wave of joy hit me. I'd advanced to Silver Knight. I tested my new powers. I pulled water element energy to my palm, and it condensed into an actual ball of clear water floating above my hand. I flipped my wrist, and it flowed between my fingers before dissolving back into energy. Then I tried fire. A fireball rune appeared naturally in my mind. Fire energy gathered in my palm and shaped itself into a fist-sized fireball. It danced on my skin without burning me. On impulse, I opened my mouth and swallowed it. My inner sense tracked it. The flame-devouring technique broke it down into pure fire energy that flowed through my meridians and fed into the red sprout. I laughed. Not only had I become a Silver Knight, I gained the abilities of a mage as well. After absorbing the spirit insect and advancing to Silver Knight, I stepped outside to find the orc's magic eagle still circling overhead, watching us. It had been there since delivering the wooden box before dawn. I told my men to ignore it and keep piling snow into the canyon. In 3 days, we dumped so much that the passage was blocked by a massive ice and snow slope, over 100 meters long and more than 10 meters high. On the third afternoon, the orcs made their move. They drove 10,000 ragged, starving human slaves toward the wall, pushing 500 carts ahead of them. A few sharp-faced slaves at the front started shouting, trying to rally the others, telling them the noble lord's territory was just on the other side, that if they climbed over, they'd be saved. The crowd surged forward. Thousands scrambled up the snow slope, sinking into it, trampling over each other. My guards answered with catapults, launching showers of stones into the crowd. People fell screaming, heads split open, but the ones behind kept climbing over the fallen. Then Sahalian appeared, carrying the wooden box with the mithril armor. He tried to walk up the slope, but immediately sank into the snow. He stopped and shouted that he was the orc high priest, a friend of humans, and that he'd come to meet me as agreed, bearing a gift of mithril armor. My guards responded with more stones. He raised a magic barrier with his bone staff and blocked them. He called out again about our agreement. More stones. He blew them away with a gust of wind and shouted about the slaves and supplies. More stones. He gave up and retreated to Kuei-Luan. Their plan had been seen through. We wouldn't even show our faces. Kuei-Luan cursed and ordered the slaves driven forward again. Orc soldiers beat anyone who tried to turn back, crushing skulls with spiked clubs. The terrified slaves surged toward the snow wall once more, sinking deeper, dying in the ice, their bodies and blood slowly packing down a path. Azaj begged Kuei-Luan to let the warriors charge. Kuei-Luan turned to Sahalian and called him out. He realized the priest had been subtly pushing him toward this assault all along. Sahalian admitted it. They both knew the canyon and the fortress were the keys to holding this territory. Humans wouldn't give them up willingly. The orcs' only option was to fight, and fight fast. Kuei-Luan made his decision. He ordered Azaj to charge with 3,000 orc warriors. Azaj led the rush up the blood-soaked snow slope, stepping on corpses. He punched through ice that cut into his legs, blasting heat from his body to shatter the frozen crust around him. My crossbow teams fired volleys of heavy bolts at him. He grabbed another orc and used him as a shield. The bolt punched clean through the body and grazed Azaj's arm. Wounded and bleeding, he kept screaming for his troops to push forward. The orcs went mad, climbing over dead slaves and fallen comrades, trampling blood and flesh into the snow, packing it harder with every step, still pushing upward. Kuei-Luan was losing his mind watching his warriors struggle in the snow. He'd never faced an enemy like this, one who refused to fight head-on and just used walls and snow to trap his soldiers. He demanded Sahalian find a solution. The old priest revealed he'd planned ahead. During the 3 days while we kept piling snow, he'd had the orcs load their carts with black stone, a type of coal from the Black Mountains that burned hotter and longer than wood. His plan was to push the carts against the snow wall, light them with fire magic, and have the priests cast wind spells to blast the flames forward. A young priest named Jinguna threw a fireball to ignite the carts, doused in tung oil. The coal caught fire, but Jinguna collapsed after casting a second fireball, completely drained. The fire was growing, but compared to a snow barrier over 100 meters long and more than 10 meters high, it looked almost pitiful. Bear 2 came running to my room in a panic, shouting about the orcs using fire magic. He found me sitting inside, casually roasting a piece of deer meat with a flame in my palm. He stared, speechless. I went to have a look. Standing on the wall, I smelled sulfur and watched the orcs feeding more carts into the fire. On its own, the fire wasn't much of a threat. They couldn't even get close to us. Then the orc priests lined up behind the fire and began casting wind spells together. The breeze turned into a gale, driving smoke, steam, and heat straight at our wall. My guards tried to shield me, but I waved them off. Through the smoke, I spotted a figure running to the canyon bend and kneeling. Behind that corner, more orc troops poured out. Kuei-Luan himself had come to the battlefield. I pointed it out to my men. If we didn't hurt the orcs badly enough here, They'd keep coming for our territory. Bear 2 begged me to bring up the Night Corps. I told him to relax. We were stronger than this orc force. The only reason I'd chosen to defend was to keep our casualties low. The terrain worked entirely in our favor. The orcs couldn't spread out, couldn't use their numbers, couldn't build momentum for a charge. One of my soldiers admitted how terrifying orc charges were, like being hit by warhorses. I pointed deeper into the canyon. All their best fighters were right here, packed into ground that wouldn't let them use their strength. That was exactly why I'd had them pile all that snow. I wanted the orcs to attack, to exhaust themselves against something they couldn't overcome, and to die wondering what went wrong. "Come on," I said. "Show me what you've got." The crossbow strings started snapping from the cold, one after another. Bear 2 scrambled to switch everything over to catapults. He tried to flatter me about designing both weapons, but I wasn't listening. I was watching the canyon. A squad of orcs had reached the snow wall and vanished. Just disappeared. I told Bear 2 he'd have a busy night and ordered a squadron of knights brought up to the wall. My intelligence soon confirmed what I suspected. The orcs had dug a tunnel through the snow and reached the base of our stone wall. Over 100 of them were down there, widening the passage to send more troops through. I also learned that Sahalian had given up. He told Kuei-Lun that even if they broke through, the best outcome was mutual destruction, and come spring, the southern nobles would wipe them out anyway. He took his priests and left that night, heading north. He returned the damaged mithril armor to Kuei-Lun before going. There was useful intelligence too. The heat from the fires had melted and refrozen the snow near the canyon's west exit, forming a brittle ice shell with icicles hanging from it. A strong enough impact would bring everything crashing down and bury the road. The key detail: at 3 in the morning, 500 wolfmen and 40 pigmen would push through the snow tunnel and try to break the wall. If I acted too early, the timeline would shift. I pressed my hand against the wall, but couldn't tell the vibrations apart from the catapults firing. I needed someone who could pinpoint the digging. I offered a promotion to Knight Squadron Leader for whoever could find the exact spot. A young knight named Cole pressed his ear to the ice and found it immediately. I asked him how he'd stop the orcs if they broke through. His plan was smart. Pour hot water down into the tunnel to flood and freeze the diggers. Set up barriers on the west side of the wall. Coat everything in water to make it a skating rink. Then dump ice water on any orc that made it through. No swords needed. The cold would kill them. I gave him command of the squadron on the spot and had Bear 2 assign 2 battalions of builders to help. Buckets of hot water were poured into the spot where the digging sounds came from. The west side of the wall was packed with obstacles, all frozen together with water. Kuei-Lun found out his tunnel had been discovered but pressed forward anyway. His diggers were already at the wall itself. He ordered a full assault. Wolfmen charged into the snow tunnel, while others scrambled up the slope over piled corpses. 40 pigmen squeezed in behind them. A pigman shoved its way to the front of the tunnel and smashed through the wall with an iron hammer. It burst out the other side, and its hooves hit pure ice. It slid straight into a barrier, its tusks jamming into a wooden stake, legs kicking uselessly on the frozen ground. More pigmen followed, stumbling and sliding the moment they stepped out. Then the wolfmen pushed through behind them, cramming into the narrow space between the wall and the obstacles. Cole gave the order from the wall top. Pour. Buckets of snow water cascaded down on them. The pigmen screamed from the cold, soaked and shaking. The wolfmen behind shoved forward into the same trap, instantly drenched and freezing. They couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't go forward or back. Cole grinned and kept the water coming. "Don't stop." The wolfmen kept coming through the breach in the wall. One leaped at a barrier, slipped on the ice, and impaled itself on a sharpened stake. The smell of blood drove the others into a frenzy. They jumped over corpses, clawed past obstacles, and kept pushing forward. My knights formed up in tight squares with crossbows positioned in the gaps between them. The first volley punched through a dozen wolfmen. A wolfman officer saw the formation and hesitated, but when the orc war horns sounded from deep in the canyon, he charged anyway. The few who reached the night lines were skewered by cross lances. The pigmen were tougher. They used their thick hides to bulldoze through barriers, absorbing crossbow bolts, and pulling the shafts out while their comrades propped them up. Wolfmen sacrificed themselves to block shots aimed at the pigmen. I walked along the top of the wall and dumped piles of boulders from my soul vessel onto both breach openings. crushing wolfmen underneath and sealing the holes. Then I gave the order that confused everyone. Aim the catapults at the canyon walls. The knights took over operating the machines, hurling stones at the cliff faces. The impacts shook loose the massive icicles and ice sheets that had formed from 3 days of melting and refreezing. Cracks spread through the ice. Then it all came down. Huge sheets of snow and ice peeled off the canyon walls and crashed into the gorge below. The orcs, already frozen, exhausted, and demoralized, panicked. They remembered their comrades who'd been buried alive before, and their will to fight broke completely. They ran. Their stampede shook loose even more snow. The avalanche fed on itself, getting bigger with every collapse. Kuei Luin dodged falling ice from the back of his magic wolf. He wanted to stop the retreat, but couldn't. Ice was raining down on him too. A falling chunk buried one of his commanders right in front of him. He dug the orc out, but the man was coughing blood. Kuei Luin looked around at his leaders, all avoiding his eyes. He knew it was over. Retreat, he spat through clenched teeth. They fled toward Riftwind Fortress without looking back. On our side, I shouted the order to kill. My soldiers roared it back. Kill, 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 the sound echoing through the canyon and shaking more snow loose from the cliffs. The night squares pushed forward, compressing the remaining wolfmen into corners, lancing them from every direction. The beastmen had strength and claws, but in these tight quarters against disciplined formations, they had no room to use any of it. I stood on the wall, raised my soul banner, and poured blue battle chi into it. Blue light blazed through the ice and snow, covering the entire battlefield. Wherever the light touched, orc corpses dissolved into wisps of grayish mist that streamed into the banner. As the bodies vanished, the snow collapsed into the empty spaces, caving in the tunnels the orcs had dug. The surviving orcs trapped inside screamed as everything buried them. I watched the collapses spread, listened to the fading screams, and felt the soul pearls accumulating inside my banner. These orcs really were generous, delivering all this right to my doorstep. In high spirits, I put away the banner, took out my longbow, and picked off the last wolfmen cornered against the wall, one arrow at a time. By the time dawn broke, there wasn't a single orc body left in sight. I put away my bow and looked at my soldiers, some crying, some laughing, all relieved. We'd won big. Bear 2 ran up shouting about how the Grand Duke would surely raise my title. He wanted to chase the orcs and take back Riftwind Fortress. I grabbed his arm, dragged him to the other side of the wall, and pointed at the mess below, thousands of orcs and tens of thousands of human slaves buried under the snow. This snow buried them. Think it can't bury you too? His face went white. He apologized immediately. As for the title, I told him to forget it. We hadn't left any orc bodies behind. My soul banner had dissolved them all. Without proof, the nobles wouldn't acknowledge anything. And even if they did believe us, having hundreds of knights and defeating an orc army this fast would only make the old St. Laurent nobles suspicious and afraid. They'd try to undermine me. I spent the day tending to the wounded and rewarding the bravest soldiers with farmsteads as fiefs. I also honored my promise to Bear 2 for his service. The next morning, my intelligence brought several updates. Kuei Luin had learned from our snow wall tactic and was now building his own ice barrier at Riftwind Fortress's eastern exit, afraid I'd counterattack. More worrying, 4 northern orc tribes had sent 20 warriors over the mountains through hidden trails to raid Northwind City from behind. After 7 days of hard travel through the snow, losing 5 along the way, 15 had reached the area near our western settlement outposts. 4 of them were bronze-rank knights. These weren't ordinary orcs. There was also useful news. A 3rd-rank forest python was hibernating in a cave near Outpost 7. Easy to kill while it slept, and the cave was full of valuable snakegrass herbs. Clearing that python would also open a safe path to the western coast and its natural harbor. And one more thing. Lady Alina had decided to visit me during the winter ceasefire. Some young nobles from St. Laurent, curious whether I matched the heroic image from storybooks, were tagging along on a Silver Moon Trading Company ship. They'd depart within 7 days. I sighed. No wonder this territory had stayed undeveloped for a century. Orcs wandering in to raid whenever they pleased. Who could build anything under those conditions? I needed to seal those mountain paths and eventually reclaim the abandoned baronies to the north. I couldn't spend forever on defense. I summoned Bear 2 and ordered him to take 2 night squadrons to Northwind City immediately. He was skeptical that orcs could cross the mountains in winter, but I explained that every summer and autumn, small groups snuck through. That's why such a large territory was only a viscountcy. He charged off eagerly, but I warned him not to underestimate the enemy. Those 4 bronze-rank knights were serious fighters who'd survived a mountain crossing in deep winter. At Northwind City, Bear 2 questioned the garrison commander. No orcs had been seen, but a settler from the outpost had reported strange footprints in the mountains the day before. The commander had assumed they were from orc slaves on some errand. Bear 2 set him straight. Those were enemy raiders, and ordered the city gates sealed. He rode west and soon spotted 15 orcs dragging captured farmhands toward Northwind City. When the orcs saw 200 mounted knights bearing down on them, they bunched together. One stepped forward and challenged Bear 2 to single combat, calling him a coward. Bear 2 considered it. I told him there were 4 bronze-rank fighters among them. He'd lose a duel, but refusing would look weak. So he found a third option. "What makes you worthy of fighting me?" he sneered, grabbed his lance, and charged. 200 knights thundered after him. The orc who'd issued the challenge dodged Bear 2's lance and smashed his horse's leg with a spiked club. The horse crashed down and Bear 2 went flying. Before the orc standing over him could bring the club down on his skull, 2 lances punched through the orc from both sides. The charge rolled over all 15 orcs in seconds. 200 horses trampling, 200 lances thrusting. The orcs were turned to pulp before they could even put up a real fight. Bear 2 was lying on the ground with his leg shattered. The bone was crushed, hit by a bronze-rank orc during the charge. His riders had killed all 15 orcs, but he'd been thrown from his horse when one smashed his mount's leg with a spiked club. I rode up with my guards and looked down at him. I tossed him a low-grade healing potion from my soul vessel. It wouldn't fully fix a crushed bone, but it would keep him going. I told him to recover in Northwind City and handed command of Riftwind Canyon's defense to Thomas. Bear 2 drank the potion. It made his leg tingle and itch as the medicine worked, but Thomas checked afterward and said the bone was still broken. The potion had healed the flesh and stopped the bleeding, but the shattered bone was beyond its power. Bear 2 told Thomas he wanted to settle down, start a family, and have his children serve me instead. He didn't think he'd ever stand properly again. I rode west, furious at the damage the orc raiders had done to the outpost settlements along the way. This orc problem had to be solved. If I built my harbor and this route became a major road, another raid could cause far worse losses. We reached Outpost 7 and spread out to search the forest for the Python's cave. After hours of combing through brush, a knight found it. I led my guards inside. The cave was spacious, good potential as a supply depot or garrison post near the future port. But deeper in, we heard hissing and screaming. My scouts came scrambling out in terror. The python was awake. I turned and ran for the exit. A massive tail swept out behind me and smashed against the cave mouth just as I jumped clear. The forest python emerged, enormous, with amber eyes that looked down at us coldly. My guards charged with spears, but they bounced off its scales like hitting metal. One sweep of its tail snapped a dozen spears and sent men flying. Then vines erupted from the ground where I'd been standing. Magic. This was a true magical beast. I activated my battle chi, coating my body in blue energy like armor. I launched myself over the snake's head, landed behind it, and drove my sword into its midsection while my guards held its attention from the front. Blood sprayed out. It whipped around to bite me. I dodged and slashed its tail, cutting deep to the bone. But then its body glowed green and the wounds started healing before my eyes. I launched a wind-breaking slash, a blade of blue energy that flew from my sword and tore into the snake's body. It screamed and retaliated by spitting beams of green light. Wherever the light hit the ground, snake grass herbs erupted from the soil and grew wildly. So that's how magical herbs were created. The beasts themselves generated them. After several exchanges, I saw it try to retreat into the cave. I leaped above it and drove my sword down, splitting its rear half in two. It coiled up defensively, glaring at me with hatred and fear. I switched to my bow. Arrow after arrow, each infused with battle chi. It dodged some, but I kept hitting it. Neck, face, skull. Arrows bristled from its head like a porcupine. Its severed lower half left it unable to flee properly. Then it collapsed and went still. I thought it was dead and sent 2 guards in to finish it off. They started hacking at it, but when I stepped close and aimed an arrow at its eye, it suddenly dodged and bolted. The creature had been playing dead. I cursed its cunning, sprinted after it, jumped onto its back, and drove my sword straight down through its body. It convulsed, contracted, raised its head once, and went still for real this time. I pulled the entire carcass into my soul vessel for refining, then ordered my guards into the cave to collect everything useful. My guards spent an hour pulling up every snakegrass herb they could find inside the cave. I stored the whole pile in my soul vessel, already imagining how many nights I could train with them plus the ones growing outside. Then a guard came running in, pale-faced. The snakegrass outside had all withered and turned yellow. I went to look. The entire field was crumbling to dust in the wind. I picked up a stem and it broke apart in my fingers. I told my men not to worry. Those herbs had been magically created by the python's breath. They looked real, but had no actual medicinal value. True snakegrass needs years of natural growth to build up its properties. Magic can fake the shape, but not the substance. That's why real magical herbs are so rare. One sharp-eyed young guard spotted a single green sprout hidden among the dead plants, a genuine one that had been growing naturally. I gave it to him as a reward. He was overjoyed. I caught the smell of the sea on the wind and looked westward. The path to the coast was clear now. Back at Northwind City that evening, I stood on the walls and called for Bear 3. I told him guests were coming, young nobles from St. Laurent, including Lady Alina. They needed proper accommodations. The Viscount's keep had been repaired but could only hold about 100 people. I gave him 7 days to fix up the nearby estates as well, with fresh furnishings and plenty of charcoal for heating. Bear 3 suggested serving red blood ginseng at the banquet to impress the visitors. I shut that down immediately. That ginseng was our secret weapon for rapidly developing knights. If those nobles found out we had something that powerful, they'd come after us. We'd use local ingredients instead. See fish, venison, wild mushrooms. Done well, those could be impressive enough. I also told him to pick 30 clever young men for me. He seemed to connect this with the python I'd killed, probably guessing that the power I granted was linked to magical beasts. He was smart enough not to ask. Then I brought up something important. Wounded and crippled soldiers needed to be taken care of, given proper jobs, not abandoned. Bear 3 looked worried about finding enough positions, but I explained. Merge nearby farmsteads into villages, villages into towns. All those communities needed administrators, peacekeepers, and trainers for reserve troops. Disabled veterans had the skills for all of that. It wasn't charity, it was practical. Bear 3 called me merciful. I scoffed at that. I knew the truth. Loyalty isn't free. It comes from binding people's interests to yours and from holding power over their lives. I just made sure the deal was fair enough that everyone benefited. Later, I asked Luke what kind of person he thought I was. He said I must be a messenger from heaven, sent to save them. I laughed. I could save this corner of the world for now, but not forever and not everywhere. I told him civilization needs young people who charge forward bravely, but they also need to think about why they're fighting. Saving the world once means nothing if it falls apart again. The real goal is to plant seeds, sparks that can grow into something lasting. Where those sparks lead would be up to them. I'd take them out into the wider world, but after that, they'd have to walk on their own. Luke looked relieved when he realized I wasn't planning to leave them. I told him to pick replacements for the guards we'd lost today, and he followed me down from the wall with a spring in his step. That night, I walked the corridors of the Viscount's keep alone, thinking about everything. A fishing boat had spotted what might be a coastline to the northwest days ago, but no follow-up had come. I wondered what was out there, an island or another continent. I needed resources and time, and I was short on both. The orcs wouldn't wait. The duchy's nobles wouldn't wait. The people eyeing my territory from the shadows wouldn't wait. I wanted someone to talk to, someone to point me in a direction. But there was nobody. I had to figure it out myself. I spread out the old Viscount's maps and the Valley Baron's notes side by side. To the north, for baronies held the key passes into the mountains. All destroyed, their people killed by orcs. The next morning, my intelligence brought excellent news. The orcs had sealed the eastern exit of Riftwind Canyon with logs and snow. Kuei Luan's leadership was crumbling. Several tribal leaders blamed him for the disastrous losses and for Azaj's death. Some had already slipped away north, following the priests. Kuei Luan, shaken, decided to abandon Red Maple City entirely and retreat to the grasslands, using slaves to block the roads behind him. A fishing boat would discover a large ice-covered island to the northwest today. It had snow elves living on it, curious but not hostile. The ice-sealing Northwind fortress was getting thicker, not thinner, fed by the rising magic tide. The 4 destroyed baronies to the north could be reached by sailing around the coast and up the river mouth, hitting the orc tribes from behind while they had no defenses. And my 286 orc slaves in Black Mountain territory had all reached Black Iron Knight level through training and soul blood feedback. I slammed my fist into my palm. The tables had turned. It was my turn to attack. I ordered all the orc soldiers from Black Mountain transferred here immediately. Then I called for Bana and gave him a mission. Take a night squadron, sail to the newly discovered island, establish a settlement, and explore it in 2 directions. One team inland to map terrain and resources, another along the coast to find harbors. Plant markers everywhere claiming it as our territory. Don't fight magical beasts unnecessarily. Just gather information and come back. Luke worried we'd be spread thin with guests coming, but I told him not to fuss. We had thousands of construction workers and garrison troops available. I ordered Bear 3 to lead a massive work crew, soldiers, knights, and builders, to cut a road through the old forest westward to the coast, straight to that round lake with the natural harbor. 3 days to finish it. With the forest python dead, there was nothing blocking development anymore. That harbor would change everything. Ships from the south could deliver supplies directly to Northwind City, turning it into a trade hub. Dock taxes, market fees, warehouse rents. Enough revenue to feed tens of thousands. Luke asked what I wanted to name the port. I looked at the white clouds drifting past the window and thought about the python that had kept everyone away from that place for so long. It deserved some kind of memorial. White Cloud Harbor, I said. Luke stared at me, confused by the connection. I just laughed and sent him off to get it done. Bear 3 nearly fell over when Luke told him the deadline. 3 days to cut through old-growth forest? But Luke pointed out that knights and soldiers could each do the work of 10 builders. Let the strong ones chop, let the builders haul. Bear 3 agreed, and realized something else. If the war with the orcs was almost over, they'd need to be more selective about recruiting. Too many soldiers with no war to fight would just drain the food supply. Luke asked him how long he thought it would take me to finish the orcs after spring arrived. Bear 3 thought about everything he'd seen over the past few months, stood up, and answered, 3 days. Then he went to cut the road. Near evening, the orc slaves I'd summoned came running into Northwind City, exhausted and collapsing at the gates. The city guards panicked at first, thinking it was an orc attack, before noticing the red cloth strips marking them as ours. Their leader, Slave 1, was brought to me while I was eating dinner. He knelt at the doorway and waited. I let him kneel there for half an hour while I finished my meal. When I finally acknowledged him, he reported 286 orc soldiers, all now at Black Iron Knight level. I told him to fill out a full battalion, but he said the tribes had no one left to recruit except the old and young, and he wouldn't pad numbers with weaklings. Fair enough. I gave him his mission. The orcs were trying to flee but had blocked their own escape routes. I planned to send his troops by sea, around the mountains, up the river mouth, and into the orc heartland from behind. Whatever prisoners he captured, he could pick from them to fill his ranks. But the coastal road wasn't finished yet, so tomorrow they'd join the tree-cutting crews first. That night, I stood at the window, feeling my battle chi growing. The sprout in my core had grown taller, its 2 leaves swaying gently. Water, fire, and wood. 3 elements balanced inside me, feeding each other. Then a guard reported something interesting. A lone orc slave had been circling the castle, acting suspicious. He said he had something important to tell me personally. I had him brought up. He threw himself on the floor and started banging his head against the stone dozens of times. When nobody stopped him, he finally looked up. His name was Hachi, and he claimed to be the son of the previous orc chief. He wanted me to give him a squad of orc soldiers. In return, he promised to bring me the entire orc race. He'd kill the disobedient ones and make the rest submit. He said he was stronger than Slave 1, that he had a chief's blood, and that only he could make the tribes surrender willingly. I told him I couldn't spare any troops right now, but he was welcome to recruit his own. However many orcs he brought in, I'd grant them power. Then I gave him a name, Slave 2. He tried to insist on keeping his birth name, but I didn't give him a choice. He repeated it a few times, mangling the pronunciation, and decided he liked it. That told me everything I needed to know about him. I tested him, asked about beast transformation potions, and wolfmen. He lied badly both times, claiming he'd never heard of them. His eyes gave him away. I sent him off with orders to lead his own separate unit of orc slaves. After he left, my attendant Florian spoke up, concerned. He said Hachi had no fear, no loyalty, and no respect in his eyes. He wanted to kill him on the spot. I stopped him. I knew perfectly well this orc would betray me eventually. His ambition was too big. He'd never stay under anyone's command. But that was exactly why he was useful. Let him go recruit the orcs who were angry at Kuei Lun. Let him challenge Kuei Lun for leadership. The more the orcs fought among themselves, the better for us. I'd watch how far he got before he showed his true colors. Through my intelligence, I learned what happened after the guards brought Hachi back to the orc slave camp. Slave 1, whose real name was Manwu, confronted Hachi immediately. He was furious that Hachi had gone behind his back to see me. Hachi showed off his new strength, boasting about being a first-rank warrior now. He bragged about how he'd tricked me with the name. I'd said, Slave 2, but he'd pretended to hear, newer, a proper-sounding name, and claimed I'd accepted it. Slave 1 grabbed him by the collar. He saw nothing but raw, naked ambition in Hachi's eyes. He warned him that he had no idea what my real power looked like, that he was a fool who'd been blinded by his own small gains. Hachi brushed it off, claiming I hadn't killed him because I feared his bloodline and what his death might stir up among other orcs. Slave 1 kicked him in the chest and called him an idiot. But Hachi wouldn't listen. Slave 1 eventually gave up. He decided the old chief's bloodline didn't matter anymore. They were slaves now, not the Gus tribe. Survival of his people came first. I noticed I'd been sleeping more than usual and had actually grown taller. My pants were too short. The advancement to Silver Knight was still changing my body. My morning intelligence told me the orcs were retreating in groups, with Kuei Lun sending 3 commanders ahead to scout safe routes. Hachi had already recruited 13 followers from among the slaves, and Slave 1 had decided to stop protecting Hachi, seeing him as someone consumed by ambition. The road building was on schedule. 10,000 workers cutting through the forest would connect to the harbor in 3 days. Bear 3 had even found a druid to use plant magic on the leftover tree stumps, growing mushrooms to rot the roots faster and flatten the road. I wasn't worried about Hachi's scheming. He was useful. Let him run around conquering orc tribes. It saved me the trouble. His people were capped at first rank anyway. He was no threat. On the 4th day, I went to White Cloud Harbor to send the orc slaves off. 286 of them stood on the dock in 2 formations, Slave 1's large group and Hachi's tiny squad of 13. I gave them their orders. Sweep through every orc tribe that wouldn't submit, seize their goods and prisoners, and map every mountain, river, and resource in the north. Especially magical herbs and spirit insects. No mistakes on those. They sailed north, landed at a river mouth, and marched east for 2 days until they found the first tribal camp. They crushed it easily. Every one of my orc slaves was Black Iron Knight level. The tribespeople had no chance. Many didn't even realize they were under attack until it was too late. Hachi immediately stepped in front of the prisoners, announced himself as the former chief's son, denounced Kuei Lun as a failure, and recruited every survivor on the spot. Then he marched off toward the next tribe, taking all the prisoners and credit with him. Slave 1 watched him go and said nothing. One of his soldiers complained, but Slave 1 told them to let it go. Hachi's heart was too wild. He could feel betrayal coming. The other slaves were scared of being dragged down with Hachi when the reckoning came. Slave 1 told them their best chance was to work hard, earn merit, and distance themselves from Hachi completely. If they could find a spirit insect for me, that alone might be enough to save them. He led his team along the river to map the territory and catalog resources, doing the part of the mission that actually mattered to me. His soldiers asked why I wanted such detailed maps. Maps are land, Slave 1 said. The master doesn't just want supplies. He wants to own the entire north. Then we have no home anymore. If we do well enough, the master might reward us with a mountain of our own. A peaceful one, no more wars. We already serve him. Who would we fight? They thought about that for a moment, then started walking. These past few days I'd been checking my intelligence every morning, tracking the orc slave's progress up north. Slave 2 was tearing through the countryside like a hungry wolf. 5 small tribes conquered in a single day, absorbing nearly 200 prisoners. The kid thought he was destined for greatness. I couldn't help but smirk. Slave 1 took the opposite approach. Knowing that Hachi's recklessness would eventually bring consequences, he focused on survival through merit. Instead of fighting over prisoners, he walked the riverbanks, carefully mapping every feature of the terrain, exactly as I'd asked. Banna had pushed deeper into the snow island and found descendants of snow elves. They hadn't formed any real society, and no one else had claimed the territory. Good news. The Silver Moon Trading Company's fleet had departed today. Lady Alina was on board, along with various young nobles. One detail caught my eye. A marquis's son had taken offense at hearing Alina thought highly of me, and was coming with his friends to warn me off. I hadn't even met Alina yet, and I was already making enemies among the higher nobility. I just hoped he wasn't too powerful. I wasn't in the mood to play the humble victim. Then something unexpected happened. Sharp eagle cries rang out from outside my window. 8 riftwind eagles chasing each other across the sky near the city. That was strange. These were magical beasts that lived deep in the mountains. Bear 3 came running with the explanation. One of those eagles wasn't really an eagle. It was a man named Cedric, a druid who could shape-shift into animals and magically grow plants. He was the one Bear 3 had recruited to rot tree stumps on the new road. Usually quiet and hardworking, but today he'd somehow drawn 7 wild riftwind eagles right toward the city. The lead eagle dove into the forest west of Northwind City, and the other 7 circled above, too afraid to follow into the trees. 7 first-rank magical beasts couldn't catch him. That meant he was no weakling, and he'd been hiding in my territory this whole time without my intelligence system ever flagging him. That bothered me. Bear 3 asked if I wanted to capture him or take his soul blood by force. I said no to both. Extraordinary beings have their pride. Forcing them only breeds resentment. I told Bear 3 to approach him carefully and talk. I also warned him about people with real power. Those who carry swords tend to solve problems by eliminating the person who created them, not by finding solutions. One careless moment, and people die. Special individuals like this druid needed careful handling. After Bear 3 left, I stood in the corridor watching the eagles disappear toward the canyon, and something gnawed at me. My intelligence system hadn't mentioned this druid at all. No warning, no background, nothing. Because there was no prior connection between us, no thread of cause and effect for the system to track. I'd been relying too heavily on the system. If the intelligence didn't mention something, I simply didn't think about it. That was a dangerous habit. This druid was hiding his true nature for a reason, and everything in my territory belonged to me. I'd find out what he was really after. At noon, Bear 3 came running in and dropped to his knees. The druid Cedric had disappeared. I wasn't surprised. The man could turn into animals. Of course he could hide from Bear 3. I asked why Cedric would run, and why he'd led magical beasts toward the city in the first place. Bear 3 started stammering. He insisted Cedric wasn't dangerous, that he'd only recently met him through Bear 5's introduction. That's when the real story came out. Bear 5's real name was George Soros, the illegitimate son of Marquis Soros. His mother had died recently and revealed his parentage before passing. The Marquis had sent the druid Cedric to find his son and bring him back, with a ransom payment offered for his release. I asked Bear 3 the obvious question. If I hadn't brought it up, would he have told me any of this? He hesitated, then tried to brush the eagle incident off as birds playing around. That told me everything. He would have kept quiet and let the druid sneak Bear 5 away behind my back. I gave him my terms. Cedric could take Bear 5, but he had to deliver a complete druid inheritance, the knowledge and techniques of his craft, to me by noon tomorrow. Bear 3 said he couldn't find Cedric. I told him a druid always leaves ways to watch his surroundings. Birds, plants, insects could all be his eyes. He'd know Bear 3 was looking for him. Then Bear 3 cautiously asked about the soul blood restriction on Bear 5. He said Cedric had told them it might be dark magic, possibly soul control. I let my battle chi curl around my fingertip like a blue flame and told him plainly, if I didn't have the druid inheritance by noon tomorrow, I would destroy Bear 5's soul. Let them try running. It would be a good demonstration of my reach. Bear 3 tried to speak up for Bear 5. I told him to get out. I called Luke and ordered my guards recalled and readied. We might have a guest to invite over. Through the birds that served as his eyes, Cedric learned people were searching for him. He didn't think much of it, just a backwater noble who couldn't possibly understand what a druid was capable of. He strolled back to his dwelling without concern. Bear 3 met him there and confessed everything. He'd panicked when my attendant came asking questions, assumed I already knew the truth, and told me everything to try to protect Cedric. He explained that I had a way of knowing things before they happened. Every battle, every ambush, every plan had been anticipated. Hiding was pointless. Cedric was furious. He demanded to know what Bear 3 had revealed, and when he heard about the druid inheritance demand, he exploded. He said I was nobody, that his inheritance wasn't something a petty noble deserved, and that no one could stop him if he chose to leave. Bear 3 reminded him about George. Bear 5's soul blood was in my hands. One thought from me, and the boy would die. Cedric went quiet. He'd promised Marquis Soros he would bring George back alive. That promise bound him. He told Bear 3 to come back tomorrow and let him think. Bear 3 pressed him. Was he planning to run? Was he going to hand over the inheritance? Cedric just repeated himself with a hint of contempt in his eyes. Tomorrow. Bear 3 left, promising to return first thing in the morning. The next morning I sat in the great hall, furious. I'd expected the druid might try something clever, but not this clever. My intelligence laid it all out. Cedric had spent months carefully investigating before making his move. He'd confirmed that Bear 3 and the others were the guards sold off by the Silver Moon Trading Company. He'd deliberately befriended Bear 3 to locate Bear 5, George, on Dragon Coil Mountain. Under cover of darkness, he'd told George about his real father, the Marquis. George wanted desperately to return to his birth father's side for a life of wealth and status, but he was too afraid of my powers to just run. He'd told Cedric everything he knew about my abilities. When Cedric heard about the soul banner that could capture and refine souls, he concluded I must be a puppet controlled by some evil mage behind the scenes. That made him even more cautious. His actual plan was intricate. He'd already given George a druid inheritance and intended to use a druid technique, a variation of damage transfer, to shift the soul blood mark from George's body into an unhatched magical beast egg. The egg had to be from a creature that hadn't yet developed a soul. That's what the eagle eggs were for, and why he'd been provoking the Riftwind Eagles. He was stealing their eggs. But even if the mark transferred successfully, it wouldn't break my control. The soul blood energy had already sunk too deep into George's bloodline. The real druid inheritance, the true one, was hidden inside an acorn, concealed in a wall panel of his room, painted to match the wood. It contained a root-level druid glyph condensed through months of effort. To activate it, you needed wood attribute spiritual energy. Once refined, you could bond with an oak seed or magical plant seed and absorb natural energy to become a druid. Or I could use my battle chi seed directly as the foundation. What Cedric planned to give me today was a trap. He'd drawn a shape-shifting spell model on a scroll and infused it with magic. If activated with animal blood, whoever tore the scroll would transform into that animal until the magic ran out. He intended to trick me into thinking it was the druid inheritance, turn me into a beast, and use the chaos to escape with George. I read through the intelligence twice, grinding my teeth. I sent Luke on 2 errands. First, go with Bear 3 to escort the druid here politely. Second, and more importantly, go to Cedric's dwelling and bring me every acorn in that room. Any books or unusual objects too. Luke grabbed Bear 3 out of bed, hauled him onto a horse, and rode out. Bear 3 stammered about it being too early, and Luke gave him a look that shut him up fast. I leaned back in my chair with a cold smile. A shape-shifting spell to turn me into an animal? I'd see who ended up transformed, me into a beast, or him into a corpse. That morning, Cedric heard birds warning him that riders were approaching his cabin. He scrambled to prepare. He hid the eagle egg inside a wooden box, growing a small tree from it with magic to make it look like an innocent potted plant, figuring anyone searching would be distracted by the obvious magical greenery and ignore the hidden acorn in the wall. He pulled out the bamboo tube containing the fake inheritance, the shape-shifting trap scroll, and waited outside, pretending to work the soil. When Bear 3 and Luke arrived, he acted surprised at the early visit. Luke's tone left no room for argument. Cedric climbed onto a horse and rode ahead toward the city, clutching the bamboo tube confidently. The moment he left, Luke dismounted and led his guards into the cabin. They spotted the magical tree sapling immediately, green leaves in winter, obviously abnormal. They pried open the wooden box and found the eagle egg inside. Then they tore the place apart. Bed, table, walls, floor, everything. The room was nearly empty, and at first they found nothing else. But I'd told Luke to check the west wall for acorns. He got on his knees and felt along the wood panels with his fingers until he found it. A single acorn, perfectly colored to match the wood, invisible to the eye. Luke tucked it against his chest and rode hard for the city. Meanwhile, Cedric heard his spy birds chirping frantically as he reached the city gates. He knew something was wrong, but couldn't do anything about it. A guard on the wall even talked about shooting one of the noisy sparrows, his little scouts. He swallowed his fear and rode inside. He was brought into my hall. I sat there watching him with no expression. He straightened up and introduced himself grandly. A spellcaster of the Soros Marquis household, holder of a baron's fief. I asked him how someone so noble had ended up a slave that I'd bought with my own gold. His face went ugly. He demanded a chair, insisting on being treated as a fellow baron. I asked him again, should I seat him as a baron or as a slave? He had no good answer. He took a breath, bowed, and held out the bamboo tube with both hands. He called it the Druid inheritance and asked to ransom one person. My attendant took the tube. I didn't even glance at it. I waved it aside. I stood up, smiling, and walked toward him with empty hands. He relaxed when he saw I carried no weapon. He smiled back, mentioned he hadn't eaten breakfast. He reached to rub his stomach and saw a flash of white light. My sword took his head off before he could finish his sentence. It flew from his shoulders, his eyes still wide with disbelief. After Cedric's head hit the floor, I turned to Bear 3, who was shaking with terror. I asked who else knew about Cedric's mission. He said nobody. I told him his work had been good lately, but good deeds don't erase bad ones. He'd helped cover for a man who was planning to turn me into an animal and steal my people. He begged forgiveness. I pointed out how foolish he'd been, throwing away everything he had with me to chase after a connection to some distant marquis. I sent him to Dragon Coil Mountain to keep George company. Basically, house arrest. The guards dragged him out. He didn't fight it. I had the body stripped and searched. They found a second eagle egg on him. I told them to send it to the kitchen, boiled egg for lunch. Then I noticed something on his left pinky finger. My sword tip caught on a ring hidden at the base. I pried it off and pushed spiritual energy into it. A storage ring, small but packed full. Inside I found magic stones, or samples, a pile of gold coins, and several scrolls of parchment. One was a dramatic letter claiming that if anyone found it, the great druid Cedric had been killed by evil forces and offering his inheritance as payment for revenge. I laughed and tossed it aside. Nothing but lies designed to trick gullible fools. The other scrolls contained real knowledge, shape-shifting magic, language comprehension, animal bonding, contract methods, and detailed notes on plants and animals. But nothing about actual druid cultivation. The core technique was missing. He'd hidden it somewhere. Then Luke arrived, breathless, carrying a wooden box and one acorn. He'd found it exactly where my intelligence said it would be, embedded in the west wall panel of the cabin, colored to match the wood. It looked completely ordinary, but when I squeezed it with full battle chi, it didn't budge. Not ordinary at all. Luke had also found the eagle egg hidden inside the magical tree sapling. I gave him both the sapling and the egg as rewards. The sapling might survive if it had absorbed enough magic to sustain itself, could become a real magical plant. The egg was a rift-wind eagle's, worth raising into a companion beast. I kept the acorn. That was the true druid inheritance. Later, Luke found young Hans crying in a corridor. Hans had been part of the escort taking Bear 3 to confinement, and Bear 3 had grinned at him on the way out and whispered that I was a demon who would eventually devour all their souls. Luke handled it well. He sat Hans down and talked him through it. Yes, the soul blood was a leash, like a fence around chickens or a rope on a dog. But compared to what? Before I came along, they were slaves rotting in the dirt. Now they ate meat every day, had power, had land, had futures. The nobles down south treated their people far worse, starving, freezing, working them harder than oxen. Luke told Hans that loyalty born from fear was weak. Real loyalty came from understanding that the deal was fair. I'd given them everything. All I asked for in return was one life's worth of service. Hans asked if I might someday take their souls. Luke shrugged it off. Even a demon needs people to run things. We gave a little loyalty and got back more than we ever dreamed of. What's there to complain about? He told Hans to forget what Bear 3 said. Keep his mouth shut, train hard, and trust that I wouldn't waste a useful servant. Then Luke walked away, murmuring to himself, Demon? Fine. At least this demon lets me live like a person. Over on Dragon Coil Mountain, George found Cedric's bonded bird, a blue cloud sparrow, lying dead on the ground. He panicked. A bonded creature dies when its master dies. George's mind raced through possibilities and settled on the worst one, that his half-brothers from the Soros family had sent assassins. He grabbed the young Riftwind eagle, stuffed some salted fish into a bag, and fled deep into the mountains. He had enough food for maybe 3 days. Meanwhile, I spent my time studying the scrolls from Cedric's storage ring, particularly the language comprehension parchment. I fell asleep reading it, and didn't wake until morning light hit my face. Being a noble really was the best occupation. My morning intelligence brought important updates. First, instructions on the acorn. I needed to keep feeding it spiritual energy, stamped with my own signature until the root glyph inside appeared, then swallow it whole. It would dissolve into golden energy that would flow into my battle chi seed and become part of me. Second, the shape-shifting and contract methods could be combined. By tattooing magical patterns onto the body, a person could partially transform into a beast and gain its physical abilities. More complex patterns meant stronger transformations, but with a risk of losing control. Third, the contract method contained a blueprint for a contract space. Once built on the origin tree in my consciousness, I could carry bonded creatures with me wherever I went. Fourth, and this was trouble, Cedric had planted a bewitching spell in Bear 3's mind before dying. It had activated, and for 3 days Bear 3 would unconsciously spread negative thoughts to anyone nearby. People with resentment or weak willpower would become suspicious, angry, and destructive. My attendant Hans had already been affected. Luke had calmed him down, but the damage was done. Hans now harbored hidden destructive urges and envy. Fifth, George had fled into the mountains with only 3 days of food. Sixth, the Silver Moon Trading Company fleet would arrive at Seaside Town this evening. It carried 7 bronze-rank night guards. And the Marquis's son who held a grudge against me? Raymond Soros, George's half-brother from his father's legitimate family. The web of connections was getting tangled. I noticed my intelligence system was providing more and more information as the threads of cause and effect around me multiplied. That would only increase over time. I came downstairs to find Luke waiting with a stack of papers. Squad captains were lined up in the hall, all requesting supplies. Nobody had ever been put in charge of logistics. People just handed out materials to whoever asked and was willing to take responsibility. Luke had spotted the problem on his own and stopped it before supplies got double-claimed. I was impressed. I put him in charge of all administrative work and told him to find any surviving bureaucrats or officials among our people to serve as his deputies. My people needed to learn governance. There would be more cities to manage soon. The road to White Cloud Harbor was finished. All my knights were back. I organized the defense. 1 night squadron to guard Northwind City, 1 to patrol all territories daily, and 2, including my personal guards, would ride with me to Seaside Town to meet the incoming guests. I reminded Luke that guests backed by bronze-rank knights weren't just visitors. He grabbed his sword hilt and volunteered to be my vanguard. I waved him off. We'd handle this properly. Then Luke mentioned that Hans had been acting strange since yesterday. I told him the truth. Cedric had planted a bewitching spell on Bear 3, and Hans had been caught in its spread. But the real problem wasn't the spell. It was that Hans was the only one who'd been affected. Everyone else had shrugged off Bear 3's talk about me being a demon. Only Hans had let it take root, which meant he already carried resentment inside him. The spell just brought it to the surface. Luke tried to speak up for his friend, but I'd already decided. Hans would go to Dragon Coil Mountain to join Bear 3. Whether he recovered was up to him. That afternoon, the Silver Moon Trading Company's fleet appeared on the horizon, dozens of ships sailing towards Seaside Town. My people weren't ready. I wasn't there. I was still at Northwind City handling the aftermath of the orc battles. My steward Jolin and the merchant Jelong scrambled to the docks. Jelong recognized the Silver Moon banner and panicked. This many noble visitors meant potential trouble, especially with the orcs gone and land up for grabs. He urged Jolin to call up every soldier available. Jolin ordered the garrison and even the night squadron to the docks. Hundreds of soldiers rushed to take defensive positions. From the lead ship, I later learned, the visitors watched my people scramble with mixed reactions. Raymond Soros, the Marquis's son who'd come to warn me, sneered at the disorganized defense, calling my troops untrained peasants who'd just put down their hoes. He wasn't entirely wrong about their polish, but he was underestimating what they could do. Lady Alina told him to shut up. This port was important to her family's trade routes, and the low tax rates made it valuable. She didn't want Raymond ruining the relationship before it started. A girl named Betty, daughter of Count Simeon, also snapped at him, pointing out they were guests, not invaders. Alina sent her steward Edwin ashore first by small boat to smooth things over. Edwin knew my people from previous trades and quickly found Jelong and Jolin. He explained that proper noble protocol required me to personally board the ship and invite Alina ashore. But I wasn't there, and nobody knew when I'd arrive. Jelong pointed out it would take until tomorrow at earliest to reach me by fast horse. They couldn't expect a noblewoman to sleep on a ship all night waiting. Edwin went back to consult Alina. Raymond made another snide comment about my hospitality. Alina cut him off and made the practical decision. They'd come ashore before dark, protocol or not. When someone mentioned proper etiquette, she snapped back. You want to talk etiquette with people who might talk with swords? These are unusual times. We're going ashore. She gave the order to dock. I wasn't at Seaside Town when the Silver Moon fleet arrived. I was still at Northwind City. Everything I learned about what happened came from reports afterward. The fleet appeared on the horizon that afternoon, dozens of ships. Jolin and Jelong rushed to the docks. Jelong was worried it could be trouble, so Jolin called up every soldier and the night squadron to secure the port. On the lead ship, Raymond Soros looked at my scrambling troops and laughed. He called them untrained peasants. Alina told him to stop. This port mattered to her family's business, and the low taxes made it valuable. Betty, Count Simeon's daughter, also told him to behave. They were guests, not conquerors. Alina sent her steward Edwin ashore first. He explained that proper protocol required me to personally board the ship and invite Alina down. But I wasn't there, and it would take until tomorrow to reach me. Alina decided to skip the formalities and come ashore before dark. Jolin greeted her at the bottom of the gangway, introducing himself as my older brother. Alina studied him, then suddenly asked if he had a title or was married. Then she asked if I was married or had someone I liked. Jolin said I was still young. She pushed Betty forward playfully, suggesting her as a match. Then Jolin mentioned I was turning 13 in 3 days. The noble girls erupted in whispers. 12 years old. A baron at 12? Some were disappointed, some fascinated. Raymond burst out laughing and walked away, declaring his rival was just a child. Alina looked at Jolin with a complicated expression and praised my abilities. Jolin, dazed by her perfume, blurted out that I'd promised to give him this territory someday. Alina and Betty exchanged glances. That was strange. What kind of 12-year-old conquers a huge territory and casually gives it away? Then things went very wrong. A man in the crowd had been staring at Jolin's face. He chased after Raymond and introduced himself as Andre Blackpine, son of Baron Blackpine. He told Raymond he wanted help getting his family's territory back. Raymond offered to pressure me on his behalf. Then Andre revealed something that stunned Raymond. He said this town, Seaside Town, used to be a small outpost belonging to his family's Blackpine territory. Half a year ago, Jolin had been his father's attendant, and I had been the family's lowest horse servant. A serf, not a noble at all. Raymond couldn't believe it. He'd assumed I was at least a minor noble. A horse servant? A serf? Before Raymond could announce this to everyone, Andre pulled on a face covering, worried about being recognized. But it was too late. Betty spotted him, and Jolin heard the name. Jolin froze. The old habit of kneeling before his young master fought against months of authority and comfort. He stood paralyzed, mind buzzing. Andre turned to the group and posed a legal question. If a household servant reclaims territory from orcs on behalf of his master's family, does the land belong to the servant or the master? Betty couldn't answer. Andre declared that I wasn't a free man. I was born a serf. I was his horse servant. The pioneering charter didn't change that. My soldiers had been gathering around, listening. When they heard someone calling their lord a serf and claiming his lands, rage exploded through them. Before anyone could react, a spear punched through Andre's back and out his chest, then a second from the side, into his abdomen, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. My furious guards drove their weapons into him again and again. Andre looked down at the bloody spear tips jutting from his body, then up at Jolin, blood gurgling from his throat. His lips moved. He managed one word before he fell. Jolin screamed at the soldiers to stop, but it was too late. Andre was already dead on the ground, riddled with spears. A knight stepped forward and said the man had been insulting their lord and deserved to die. He said he only wished he'd been closer to strike first. The noble visitors were terrified. Their guards had hands on sword hilts, eyes scanning the crowd of my soldiers surrounding them. Alina's guard captain quietly told her the situation was hopeless. My spearmen were all trainee knights, and the ones carrying swords were full knights. They couldn't fight their way out. Then I arrived. Hoofbeats thundered through the dark as I rode in with my escort and reined up in front of the crowd. I looked down at the shaking nobles and asked what had happened. My knight told me Andre had been slandering my name and trying to force Jolin to hand over the territory. I glanced at the body and nodded. Then he deserved to die. I turned to the best-dressed visitors with a polite smile and apologized for the scare. I offered to host them for dinner. Alina stared up at me, a boy on horseback, and tried to mention that my soldiers had killed Andre. I simply nodded, ordered the body removed, and asked again if we could eat. Betty tugged Alina's sleeve, eyes wide with fear. Alina looked at my face, saw something deep behind the boyish features, and accepted. Raymond hid between his two bronze-rank knight guards. He quietly asked one about my soldiers' strength. The guard told him there were too many knights, all black iron rank, but the sheer numbers were overwhelming. And these were supposedly the new recruits. Raymond swallowed his plans for causing trouble. Dinner was simple: white bread, fish soup, and roasted meat on wooden tables. The nobles wrinkled their noses. Betty tasted the fish soup and spat it out, complaining it was too salty and fishy. Alina politely asked if there was anything else. I told them I had no fancy cooks from St. Laurent. Betty volunteered her own cook from the ship, and Alina suggested bringing several cooks ashore. I agreed. Guests could prepare their own food if they preferred. I asked Alina about buying proper tableware. She mentioned a set of elven ceremonial vessels the Silver Moon family had acquired at great expense, plus silver cutlery from St. Lawrent's best craftsmen. I bought all of it. I was genuinely curious what nobles ate every day. Alina explained that great families raised magical beasts for food. Her family bred moon ducks and sold the eggs for enormous profit. Magical beast meat was reserved for holidays and important banquets. Betty called me a country bumpkin. I laughed and admitted we'd eaten all our magical beasts already. Then I called my attendant over and ordered a red blood ginseng, given to each young noble as a gift, letting them choose their own. Alina's eyes changed when she heard red blood ginseng. She pulled Betty away mid-question, thanked me quickly, and hurried out. The other nobles followed, practically running. Betty complained about being dragged away, saying she should have squeezed more gifts out of me. Alina told her to be quiet. She'd seen me starting to frown, and the last thing they needed was to push a 12-year-old warlord past his patience. Betty imagined getting punched by a child's fist and suddenly agreed to leave faster. Raymond stayed behind, chewing roasted meat. He admitted it tasted good, just needed spices, black pepper, rosemary, thyme. Noble-grade spices that common people couldn't afford. He watched my face carefully as he said it. Raymond stayed behind after everyone left, chewing roasted meat and talking about spices. Black pepper, rosemary, thyme. Noble ingredients that common people couldn't afford. I could tell he wasn't really talking about spices. He wanted something else. I called him out on it. He laughed nervously, then tried a clumsy excuse about his family being in the spice trade. I pointed out the obvious. Nobody in my territory could afford spices. People here were still struggling to eat. Who would buy luxury seasonings? He coughed twice and finally admitted the truth. He was here because of Alina. He'd been chasing her since childhood. She used to smile a lot back then, and her smile was beautiful. But somewhere along the way, she'd become cold and distant. Now she spent all her time building the family trading company, calculating everything, wearing that polite but empty smile. He was afraid that one day she'd marry herself off to some powerful stranger just to expand the business. I found myself genuinely interested. My gossip instincts kicked in hard. I asked if she held a title. She was a viscountess, same rank as him. But hers was honorary, no land attached. His was real, with actual territory, even if it was small. I asked about their families. He told me Alina had 3 older sisters, all honorary baronesses, and 6 brothers. She'd earned her viscountess title through her talent for commerce. As for his own family, he had 3 older brothers, but the Soros household had lost its main source of income and was declining. He was pursuing Alina, partly hoping for financial support from the Silver Moon family. The picture was becoming very clear to me. I told him I thought I understood why Alina had changed. He nearly knocked his chair over, jumping up. He was desperate to hear my theory. I laid it out for him piece by piece. With so many siblings competing for attention and resources, Alina had carved out her own path through business to prove her worth. Her combat talent was mediocre. She'd only reached Black Iron Knight level, and even that was through expensive medicines rather than real training. Raymond was also Black Iron, but he'd gotten there through his own effort. Still, in her eyes, that wasn't enough of a difference. She had money, a title, and experience dealing with all kinds of people since childhood. Naturally, she'd set her standards high. She wanted a partner who surpassed her in every way. Someone she could look up to, not someone who followed her around like a loyal pet. I asked him why he thought she'd come all the way to the frozen north. He didn't understand, so I spelled it out bluntly. His title matched hers. His strength was barely above hers. He trailed after her everywhere like a lapdog. To her, he was disposable. Meanwhile, I was like my banner, a rising morning star, destined to shine. My strength already far exceeded theirs. Titles and money were just decorations on top of real power. That was why she'd traveled here, not for him. His face turned bright red. His lips trembled. He insisted she wasn't that kind of person. I could see the denial in his eyes, but somewhere deeper, he knew I was right. I softened my tone slightly. I told him I wasn't questioning his devotion, but she was looking for a foundation for her future. She planned to use her beauty and talent to build a path forward. And since she was gifted in commerce, she certainly knew every secret about the great families, including his father's scandals with illegitimate children. What did he have beyond his family name? Everything he offered, she already possessed herself. What she wanted was something she lacked. His face went white. Then he looked at me and said something I didn't expect. He asked me to teach him. I told him to think about what he could offer first. Don't answer immediately. Think carefully. Maybe he could figure it out without my help. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he reached into a storage ring on his finger, pulled out a wooden box, and pushed it across the table. Inside were 2 rainbow swan eggs, verified to be viable, capable of hatching into living magical beasts. He'd bought them in St. Laurent specifically as a gift for Alina. Now he was giving them to me instead. I opened the box, glanced inside, closed it, and pushed it back. I called him exactly what he was, a lovesick fool who gave away his best cards before the game even started. He pushed the box back to me and begged. I tapped the lid twice with my finger, then explained the lesson. Rainbow swans, he had them, she didn't. If he built a collection of rare magical beasts and kept them for himself, eating different ones every day while she watched and wanted what he had, she'd come to him. He wouldn't need to chase her. She'd pursue him instead. When he proposed an alliance marriage at that point, she'd agree. He asked what would happen if she still refused. I shrugged and told him that was fine too. Was she really the only woman in the world? Maybe she wasn't even right for him. He needed to stop being so obsessed. Then he asked if I had feelings for Alina. I looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Her personality required constant pampering and attention. Only someone like him would put up with that. I had absolutely no interest in managing a high-maintenance noblewoman. He laughed bitterly and shook his head, saying I was too young to understand love. Then he changed the subject and asked about the scandal I'd mentioned, his father's romantic debts. I smiled but didn't answer right away. That particular topic, the Marquis's illegitimate son George hiding in my mountains, was a card I planned to play very carefully. I brought up the scandal casually, watching Raymond's face change. I asked if he'd been so busy chasing women that he didn't even know about his father's illegitimate son. He was shocked that I knew. He said these things were open secrets among nobles, but never spoken about publicly. I asked what he planned to do about it. His reaction was fierce. He said the boy had stained the family bloodline. If the bastard had stayed hidden, maybe he could live. But his mother had demanded a title for him, and their father had actually agreed. If the boy returned to the family, the Soros name would become a joke across the whole duchy. I told him the boy was currently my subordinate, loyal and hardworking, and someday he might even become Marquis Soros himself. I asked Raymond how much that life was worth. His brain nearly short-circuited. He sputtered between anger and confusion, finally blurting out that this was his brother and I was asking for money. I shrugged innocently and said the boy was my dear loyal servant. Selling him out would weigh on my conscience. He got red in the face and told me to name my price. I stood up laughing, walked behind him, and clapped him on the shoulder. I told him I was joking. The money meant nothing to me. George was on Dragon Coil Mountain. If Raymond wanted to visit, I'd arrange a guide. Whether he went or not was his choice. He stood up stiffly, adjusted his clothes, and gave me a proper noble bow. He thanked me and said he'd remember the favor. I pulled him up and told him to come eat something good with me. We walked through the camp toward the training grounds. The noble visitors were clustered in small groups, whispering excitedly. Raymond asked what they were talking about. Alina broke away from her companions and hurried over to me. She asked if I could spare more red blood ginseng. I raised an eyebrow and reminded her she ran a massive trading company. Surely she'd seen better things. She shook her head quickly. This was different. It wasn't for herself. She pointed at the noble young men crowding around my soldiers, watching them cook ginseng and offering ridiculous prices for a piece. They'd already tasted it, and now they were desperate for more. I looked at the commotion and frowned. Were all nobles this noisy and pushy? Someone spotted me and shouted my name. Instantly, the whole crowd swarmed around me like angry bees, shouting over each other. One said he was about to break through and needed more. Another offered any amount of gold. A third volunteered to send me his sister, claiming she was beautiful. They were practically climbing over each other to get my attention. I raised my hand to calm them down, but they only got louder. Raymond had been shoved to the outside of the circle. He hadn't tried the ginseng yet, and couldn't understand why everyone was losing their minds over an unranked magical beast product. When he asked, several nobles turned on him and tried to claim his share. Alina covered her forehead with her palm and sighed. She muttered that any hope of negotiating a low price was gone now. I raised my voice above the noise and told them firmly, 1 piece per person, as promised. If they wanted more, tomorrow night there would be another serving. But that was it for tonight. They begged for the extras they could see piled up nearby. I told them to leave the training camp because my soldiers needed to practice. Someone asked incredulously if we trained at night. I nodded with a completely straight face and said yes. I told them to rest up. Tomorrow morning we'd travel to Northwind City where they could see the ice-sealed fortress. It was a rare and beautiful sight they wouldn't want to miss. That promise of tomorrow's ginseng and today's spectacle finally made them back off. Then Betty appeared at my side out of nowhere. She grabbed my arm and pressed her whole body against it, calling me little brother in a teasing voice, asking what secrets I was hiding from my big sister. My hand shot up and clamped around her throat before I even thought about it. Her face turned red instantly. Her mouth opened, but only choking sounds came out. Her eyes went wide with pure terror. Everyone froze. I looked at her struggling for a moment, then let go as if nothing had happened. I told her not to sneak up on me like that. I might get the wrong idea. She stumbled backward, coughing violently, hiding behind Alina, gasping for air and staring at me with frightened, strangely fascinated eyes. Raymond came over shaking his head, telling me I had no sense of romance. A pretty girl had practically thrown herself at me, and I'd choked her. I cut him off. It wasn't important. I told everyone to leave so my soldiers could train, then turned and walked away. The nobles remembered Andre's body from earlier and swallowed whatever angry words they'd been forming. They filed out quietly, sighing with frustration. Raymond caught up to Alina and asked what was so special about the ginseng. She stopped and turned to face him. Remembering the feeling of eating it, she nodded seriously. It was a genuine treasure, a way to rapidly boost strength. Normal magical beast meat only worked if it came from high-ranked creatures and cost a fortune. This ginseng was different. Even though the creatures hadn't reached first rank, eating them released a burst of pure vital energy that noticeably increased power. The effect was especially strong for trainee knights. And from what she could see, I had hundreds, maybe thousands of them. enough to build an entire elite knight force. Raymond finally understood the frenzy. If eating one piece of meat actually made you stronger, anyone would go crazy over it. Betty poked her head out from behind Alina, rubbing her neck. Her face was flushed and her eyes had a strange, dreamy look as she complained that I was too violent. Then she teased Alina about coveting my treasures and warned her not to give me the wrong impression. Raymond looked at Alina's eager expression, those bright, hopeful eyes fixed on him, and felt himself melting again. Then his whole body jerked. My words from dinner flashed through his mind. He caught himself, pulled back his emotions, and straightened up. He told Alina calmly that yes, he thought he might have a way to help her get what she wanted. Raymond told Alina his idea for getting the ginseng, a one-for-one trade using unranked magical beasts. She immediately suggested swapping one moon duck egg for one red blood ginseng. Betty burst out laughing and warned that if Alina proposed something that lopsided, I might slap her into next week. Alina turned her hopeful eyes on Raymond, but he shrugged and spread his hands. He said he was just here to see the scenery and hadn't brought any trade goods. Then he walked off, ignoring the two girls staring daggers at his back. He wandered toward the training camp, following some curious nobles, and they all got stopped at the entrance. The smell of cooking ginseng drifted out. They could see my soldiers eating it and training afterward. Someone spotted Jolin inside and suggested calling him over since he seemed easier to deal with. Raymond told them to wait until tomorrow. He looked at Alina, who had dropped her usual cold composure completely, and felt something shift inside him. He turned and walked to his quarters without another word. Alina watched him go with a puzzled expression but didn't chase after him. The noble visitors stood outside the camp fence, watching my soldiers train and marveling at how freely I spent resources on common troops. One said if he had that much ginseng, he'd sell it all for gold rather than waste it on guards. Alina listened to everything, calculated silently, and eventually pulled Betty away to sleep on it. That night, I stayed up late reading Cedric's notes on identifying plants and animals. Around midnight, I checked my intelligence before sleeping. There were spies hidden among the visiting nobles. They'd already sent word back to St. Laurent about the red blood ginseng. If I continued fishing for ginseng tomorrow, trailing ships would follow and discover the exact location. My sailors, including Barnes, could be bribed with gold to reveal the source. But the ginseng had a critical weakness. It had evolved because of the underwater volcanic environment. Outside that heat, it would degrade rapidly. Once removed from the volcano's warmth, it would die within a day, losing all its special properties and becoming ordinary medicine. Ranked ginseng could survive in fire element environments, but would still die from ice energy exposure. Raymond had tested my advice about Alina and was already changing his behavior toward her. Today he planned to separate from her group and take his guards to Dragon Coil Mountain alone. The noble visitors had witnessed how brutally my soldiers killed Andre without hesitation. They now believed I hid savage ruthlessness behind my smile, and they feared me for it. Betty, on the other hand, had apparently developed a crush on me. Slave 2's force had swelled to 2,000, including 600 fighting-age orc warriors. He was pushing north aggressively. In about 7 days, he'd intercept the tail end of Kuei Luan's retreating army. He'd likely chase them relentlessly until he realized Kuei Luan himself hadn't gone north, then double back toward Red Maple City. No terrible news. Good enough. I reminded myself that growing boys shouldn't stay up late and rolled over to sleep. Somewhere outside, someone had tried to snoop around the camp, but spotted my patrols everywhere and gave up. The next morning I walked into the meeting hall and almost didn't recognize it. The nobles had brought their own cooks ashore, and the place smelled incredible. I admitted their kitchen staff was impressive. I'd been planning to show off my own cook at Northwind City, but it seemed pointless now. Betty jumped up and waved me over enthusiastically. Alina stood and greeted me properly. I asked if she'd slept well. She said her servants had brought everything she needed, so the only problem was the wooden walls letting wine through everywhere. Betty pushed a plate toward me, offering something her cook had made. I gently shoved her head toward Alina and stuffed a pastry into Betty's mouth instead. Then I got down to business. I'd heard the trade goods hadn't been unloaded from the ships yet. Was the deal off? Alina started making excuses, but I cut her short. I told her I didn't want to hear games. Whatever price she'd agreed on with Steward Edwin before, that was the price. I wasn't asking her to lower it. I looked her straight in the eye and reminded her that sea trade depended on trust above everything. If she wanted to keep doing business, get the cargo ashore. If she had other ideas, that was her choice, but she should think carefully. She steadied herself, put on a warm smile, and asked me to call her by her first name. Then she brought up the ginseng again, asking if I had anything with an even stronger effect. I gave her a half smile and asked if she didn't think she was being greedy. She tried to steer the conversation toward negotiating prices for last night's quality. I told her to make an offer. If the price was fair, I could spare some. But I made one thing absolutely clear. Once delivered, no returns, no exchanges. She tested the water with 2 moon duck eggs for 1 ginseng. I shut that down instantly. No hesitation. She knew the ginseng's value. If the trade wasn't equal, there was no trade. Then I turned to face the nobles who'd been eavesdropping behind us. I announced openly that I had some first-rank red blood ginseng available too, which could help Black Iron Knights advance toward bronze rank. Anyone who had something worth trading was welcome to offer. Alina's jaw clenched. She asked to speak privately. I refused. I told her my business was conducted in the open. Everyone was welcome to trade here. I offered the lowest tax rates around. If they didn't want to come, fine. If they had other schemes in mind, they should forget about them. Betty piped up with her mouth full of cake, saying her family's simian trading company could also supply me with goods. I ignored her and kept my eyes on Alina. She ran through several ideas in her head, but didn't dare voice any of them. Finally, she swallowed her pride and proposed a simple 1-for-1 swap. 1 unranked moon duck for 1 unranked red blood ginseng. I accepted. Then she immediately tried to renegotiate, complaining that her ducks were much bigger than my tiny ginseng. I told her the deal was by count, not by weight. Take it or leave it. She asked where my knightly courtesy had gone. I told her the wind blew it away. Betty exploded with laughter, shoulders shaking, covering her mouth. She gasped that she hadn't meant to laugh. Even Alina's lips twitched despite herself. The whole hall erupted in laughter over my, blown away by the wind, comment. People were doubling over, calling it the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Even the ones who'd been scared of me the night before were wiping tears from their eyes. Raymond walked over and asked me to arrange a guide for him. He wanted to leave right away. Alina immediately noticed something was off. She asked where he was going and why he wasn't coming to Northwind City with the group. Raymond shook his head and told her to go ahead without him. He'd catch up in a couple of days. Alina stared at him, confused and a little annoyed. She told him he'd changed. Before, he never would have refused her. He was always right behind her, following wherever she went. Raymond swallowed hard, clearly tempted to give in, but then he caught my expression out of the corner of his eye. I was watching him with a knowing half-smile. He snapped back to his senses and held firm. He told her the territory was full of knights, and she'd be perfectly safe. She asked when he'd be back. Before he could answer, I grabbed his shoulder and dragged him outside. I told him straight as we walked that being a lovesick puppy would leave him with nothing in the end. I suggested he find a mage to examine his brain. He stumbled along beside me, protesting that he couldn't help himself and that maybe this was just what love felt like. I told him whatever made him happy. I waved Jelong over and introduced him to Raymond. Jelong would take him by boat to Dragon Coil Mountain. Raymond was surprised it required a boat. I told him it was an island. He asked who named it. I said I did. He twitched, but said nothing more and hurried off with Jelong toward the dock. I glanced back at the noisy, fragrant hall full of nobles eating their fancy breakfast and decided not to go back inside. Over an hour later, they finally emerged, stuffed and satisfied, and found a line of sleds waiting for them in the yard. The complaints started immediately. Where were the carriages? These sleds had no cover, no roof, nothing to block the wind. One girl said they were dirty farm tools unfit for nobles. Another whined about mud from horse tails splashing everywhere. Alina walked past the complainers and came straight to me. She asked if I'd considered what would happen if filth splashed onto noble guests. I told her she had a fair point, but there were no carriages here. The alternative was walking over 100 miles through the snow. Betty pulled at Alina's arm and suggested they skip Northwind City entirely. It had just been a battlefield, nothing worth seeing. Another girl agreed, saying they'd already seen me, so why not stay a couple of days and go home? Then 7 or 8 noble sons spoke up at the exact same time. They all said no. They wanted to go. They glanced at each other awkwardly after realizing they'd answered in perfect unison. then quickly looked away. They claimed they wanted to experience the battlefield atmosphere and feel the cruelty of war firsthand. Back in Saint Laurent, it was nothing but parties and dances. A trip to the front lines would give them stories to tell. I felt something was wrong. I looked at each of their faces carefully. Why were they so desperate to reach Northwind City? I asked what was so interesting about a place that had just been through a battle. They went silent, staring at their feet. Alina stepped in to explain. She admitted that most of these young nobles were planning to come north after spring to claim new territory. The Grand Duke had decided that noble families should expand into the lands beyond Northwind Fortress. The baronies north of the fortress had fallen to orcs years ago. If I couldn't recover them myself, those lands would be opened up for other nobles to claim. I asked the obvious question. If I recovered them first, would they be mine? Of course, she said, but she advised against it. Those were established territories with developed land. If I grabbed everything, other noble families would resent me. Everyone wanted safe, productive land for their children and heirs. I asked how far they planned to expand and what kind of military force they were bringing. She claimed she didn't know. I could tell she was holding back, but I let it go. Instead, I asked about Red Maple territory. If I took it from the orcs, could I keep it? She shook her head without hesitation. Red Maple was a count's domain, and its parent family was the Lancaster Marquis House. By duchy custom, when enemy-occupied noble land was recovered by another noble, the original family had the right to buy it back at market price. So I'd do all the fighting and bleeding, and then the Lancasters would just pay me market rate and hand it to some heir who'd never swung a sword. I tilted my head and thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. Fine, I'd leave it for them. I turned to the group and told them bluntly that if they wanted to leave, they needed to go now. If they kept dawdling and ate lunch first, it would be dark before they arrived. Winter days were short up here. A noble girl caught the impatience in my voice and turned red. She asked if I was looking down on them. I didn't soften the answer. I told them they were wasting my time. They wanted to see the front lines and scout the best unclaimed land. Fine, I'd give them complete freedom. Anyone who reached Northwind City today could roam wherever they pleased tomorrow. Go anywhere they wanted. Was that satisfactory? Someone started to protest that they didn't mean it that way. I cut them off. I told them I didn't care what they meant. I wouldn't interfere with their plans or their behavior. But I expected the same courtesy in return. They were not to interfere with mine. Alina was quiet for a moment, then nodded. She agreed on behalf of everyone. I told them to move out. Tonight's accommodations at the Viscount's keep wouldn't have walls leaking wind everywhere. Betty giggled at that callback, covered her mouth, and bounced onto a sled, excited to try something new. The others hesitated, then chose between riding their own horses or climbing onto sleds. Soon hooves were pounding and snow was flying as the whole procession headed north toward Northwind City. Alina stared at my back as we set off, and for the first time, she looked like someone who wasn't getting her way. But the freezing wind and blowing snow quickly wiped every thought from her mind except survival. We rode hard for over 2 hours before I called a stop at the second camp. I told everyone to rest for an hour and drink hot soup. The noble girls immediately started complaining about the cold. They hated the sleds. Their hands and feet were numb. Alina looked down at Betty, who had curled up against her chest, shivering violently. She scolded Betty for wearing so little just to look pretty for someone. Betty could barely speak through her chattering teeth. Alina said she could handle the cold because she was a black iron knight. Then she looked around and noticed something telling. Her own guards were huddled and shaking, but my soldiers stood in the snow like statues, perfectly still, showing no discomfort at all. She sighed and said quietly that of course my people were all proper knights. Nobody had considered whether the visitors could handle this weather. I brought 2 bowls of hot soup over to Alina and Betty. Looking at the shivering nobles scattered around the camp, I asked if all of them were really planning to join the spring expansion. They looked too fragile for a stiff breeze, let alone frontier warfare. I wondered out loud if their families had thrown them away. Betty grabbed the bowl and protested. She said they were doing this for family honor, to prove their worth. I asked if she was joining the expansion too. She nodded, sipping her soup, and then suddenly started crying. Tears rolled down her cheeks and dripped into the bowl. I didn't know how to react. I told her she'd just said it was for honor, so why was she crying? Alina explained the situation. The duchy had too many nobles and not enough land to give them. Every year the Grand Duke issued pioneering orders, partly to inject energy into the kingdom and partly to push useless noble children into doing something with their lives. Most of the young people here were unwanted by their families. They'd already been assigned to next year's expedition force. Once they crossed Red Maple territory, they'd have to establish outposts with whatever guards and serfs they had, complete development within 3 years, and pay full taxes. No exceptions. I asked what the problem was. That sounded like a reasonable system. Both Alina and Betty looked at me like I was insane. Alina pointed out that these kids had no resources because their families didn't care about them. And orc warriors were generally stronger than human soldiers. If orcs found their settlements, it would be a slaughter. I suggested the obvious solution: defeat the orcs so thoroughly they wouldn't dare come south. Wasn't that what the expedition army was for? Alina asked if I'd encountered beast-transformed orcs during my battles. I said I had. She told me their strength was close to late-stage Black Iron Knights, and they came in huge numbers. When they charged, humans simply couldn't hold the line. She admitted they weren't optimistic about the spring campaign. Unless the duchy dramatically increased its number of extraordinary knights, the expedition would struggle. So they devised their own plan. First, they wanted to reclaim the 4 fallen baronies north of Northwind Fortress as a fallback position. Then they'd advance north along the coastline. If things went badly, they could retreat to my territory. I told her the idea sounded nice and she should never think of it again. She asked why. I explained that the orcs were already running. My soldiers were chasing them right now, following the exact coastal route she'd just described. She couldn't believe it. She insisted the orcs weren't that weak. Before she could argue further, one of my attendants brought over blankets. I handed them to the 2 girls and asked Alina to tell me the real reason she'd come to visit. She wrapped the blanket around herself, looked at the shivering nobles around us, and went quiet for a long time. Then she finally looked up and told me the truth. They had 2 plans. One was to land troops by sea and circle behind the orc positions. The other was a surprise attack on Riftwind Fortress. If they could score a military achievement, the Grand Commander wouldn't be able to force these young nobles into the main army's meat grinder battles. Independent credit would let them operate on their own, which gave them a much better chance of surviving. Then she asked if I could lend them soldiers. Their own guards were too few. I shook my head. Both plans were nice on paper, but neither would work in reality. She protested that they wouldn't know unless they tried, and these were already the lowest risk options available. I wished them luck, stood up, brushed the snow off myself, and walked away. She reached for my arm, but missed. I mounted my horse and gave the order to move out. The sled jerked forward so suddenly that Alina fell backward and her soup bowl flew out of her hands, crashing into the snow behind her. Every drop spilled. She hadn't gotten a single sip. Betty, however, had quick reflexes. She pressed her sleeve over her own bowl to save the red blood ginseng inside, and once the sled steadied, she swallowed the whole thing in a few bites. Betty immediately felt warmth flowing through her body. She announced happily that she wasn't cold anymore and started waving her arms around. Alina turned and asked what she'd just eaten. Betty licked her lips and said it was the ginseng. She said if she could eat one every day, she could break through to full night without even training. Then Betty leaned close and whispered about staying here permanently. Would I feed and house her if she refused to leave? Alina shot that down instantly, saying we weren't a good match. Betty pouted and asked why. Alina explained seriously that with my strength and territory, I was equivalent to a real count. Any wife would need to be at least a viscountess to provide adequate political support. Betty was only a baroness. Betty's eyes went wide. Then she grinned and pointed out that the only viscountess present was Alina herself. Too bad she already had Raymond chasing her. Alina's heart jumped at the implication, and a strange thought flickered through her mind. 2 powerful men competing for her attention would certainly be entertaining. She hid her smile and deflected, suggesting Betty could always pursue my older brother Jolan instead. Betty wrinkled her nose and said he was too dull for her taste. Alina poked her forehead and told her she couldn't afford to be picky anymore. Betty huffed, wrapped herself tighter in the blanket, and stared through the driving snow at my silhouette riding at the front of the column. The convoy pushed on through the blizzard, stopping several times for stragglers to catch up. We finally reached Northwind City just as the last light of sunset painted the sky. The moment they entered the gates, everyone looked up at the massive blue glowing ice wall sealing Northwind Fortress. One young noble gasped about how amazing it would be to become a mage who could freeze an entire city with a wave of his hand. His companion pulled him along and told him to stop dreaming. Another man brushed snow off his shoulders and laughed bitterly, saying he'd thank God if he ever even reached Bronze Knight in his lifetime. The long, cold ride had stripped every ounce of arrogance from my guests. By the time they sat down in the Viscount's hall with the fireplace blazing, not a single one complained about the food. They just ate in silence, heads down, grateful for warmth. I watched them from the main seat, allowed myself a small smile, and slipped away to the attic without anyone noticing. I lay on the reclining chair, looking at the stars through the window, and took out the acorn. It was time to strengthen my foundation and advance my cultivation. I held it up and turned it slowly in my fingers, remembering that the intelligence had said to refine it with consciousness and battle chi. I closed my eyes and dove into my awareness sea, scrolling through old intelligence reports until I found the one about the acorn. I memorized the instructions carefully, then opened my eyes and rubbed the acorn between my palms, feeling its warmth. Consciousness and battle chi. That was basically spirit, energy, and mind working together. From what I understood, druids were generalists. They knew a little magic, a little combat, some beast taming, even farming. Nothing overwhelmingly powerful, but no obvious weaknesses either. Everything was balanced. I thought about that and decided it suited my approach. Developing evenly across all areas would carry me further than chasing one extreme ability. A single towering pillar with no support would eventually collapse. Just as I was about to begin the refining process, noise erupted outside the door. Betty's voice rang through the hallway. She was calling my name and trying to push past the guards. My attendant told her not to disturb me, but she insisted she just wanted one look. I sighed and told them to let her in. She burst through the door, but immediately forgot about me when she saw the view. She ran to the window, pressed her hands against the sill, and stared up at the ice-sealed fortress glowing blue under the moonlight. She gasped about how beautiful it was and asked why I was up here alone. I told her the path to greatness was lonely. To go further, you had to endure solitude. I actually enjoyed being alone with my thoughts. She turned around with a serious expression and told me I had it backwards. Her mother had taught her that climbing higher meant making more friends and knowing more powerful people. Having a strong backer meant that even if you offended someone, they had to think twice before acting against you. I was surprised. Her logic was actually sound, even if it came from a completely different worldview than mine. I asked who taught her that. She puffed up her chest proudly and said her mother. That's why she had lots of friends. I looked back at the stars. I told her I had no friends and didn't need any. She stared at me in disbelief and said I was pitiful. I paused for a moment, looked at her earnest face, and nodded sincerely. Yes, very pitiful. She leaned closer, cheeks turning pink, and asked in a small voice if she could be my friend. I told her no. I just explained I didn't need any. She stamped her foot and asked about Raymond. Weren't we friends? I tilted my head and said I didn't recall agreeing to that. She huffed, said she was done talking to me, and stormed down the stairs. I watched her go with a smile, then took the acorn back out. I pushed my spiritual energy inside it and guided battle chi in slowly. The two energies flowed along the patterns etched within, merging together. Golden lines began glowing on the surface. Suddenly, a message fed back from deep inside the acorn, imprinting clearly in my consciousness. Swallow. The seed enters the core. Receive the basic druid inheritance. I froze immediately. Swallow it. If I did, would the power belong to me, or would the oak tree growing inside my core be the one truly in control? I had no idea what else was hidden in this acorn. Would its contents become nourishment for me, or would they take over my body? I decided not to rush. Instead, I kept feeding tiny amounts of energy into it, making the internal runes flicker without fully activating them. If I kept pouring energy in, surely that would create enough of a causal connection for my intelligence system to detect and analyze the risks. I was counting on it. Downstairs, Alina had noticed Betty sneaking toward the attic and worried the lovesick girl might do something reckless that would interfere with her own plans. She intercepted Betty at the stairs and found her coming down with tears on her face, pouting furiously. Betty threw herself into Alina's arms crying. Alina asked what happened, half expecting something terrible. Betty wailed that I wouldn't be her friend. Alina nearly laughed. She pointed out that yesterday Betty had been grabbed by the throat and nearly killed, but today she'd only been verbally rejected with no physical harm. That was progress, wasn't it? Betty dried her tears, and suddenly her eyes blazed with determination. She declared she wouldn't give up on me. Alina tried again to tell her we weren't a good match, but Betty invoked her mother's wisdom about never letting go of someone you liked. Alina remembered exactly how Betty's mother had clawed her way into the Simeon family and bit her tongue. She dragged Betty back to their room. Betty asked where Raymond had gone. Alina said she didn't know and that women shouldn't meddle in men's business. Betty pointed out that Alina herself had just been prying into my affairs. Alina denied saying anything and walked faster. At midnight, the intelligence I'd been desperately waiting for finally arrived. Alina had decided to use my strength to earn more achievements and prove herself to the Silver Moon Marquis. She planned to find a moment alone with me and activate a magical item called a charm necklace. When activated, it could make any male within 1 meter develop intense romantic feelings toward the wearer. Betty's background was exactly what I'd guessed. Her mother was a merchant's daughter who had seduced Count Simeon before he inherited his title, then used money to help him secure it. Betty had been raised on these tactics since birth. Her obsession with me wasn't real love. It was an instinct to attach herself to the strongest person available. Pure survival strategy dressed up as affection. Raymond was still on Dragon Coil Mountain searching for George. Meanwhile, George had used druid beast-taming techniques Cedric had taught him to send out his young eagle to scout. He'd spotted Raymond's ship and was now convinced the Soros family had sent assassins. He'd fled even deeper into the mountain canyons. The most critical intelligence was about the acorn itself. It contained life element genes combined with life magic that together formed the druid inheritance. But there was a devastating trap built into it. Anyone who accepted the inheritance would automatically become a follower of the nature god. The stronger they grew, the more easily they'd be assimilated, eventually becoming a puppet that could think but had no independent will. My gut instinct had been right. Swallowing it raw would have been catastrophic. But there was a safe alternative. I could place the acorn inside my soul vessel's ecosystem and repeatedly wash it with spiritual energy, then use the refining array to meld it down completely, destroying the information link to the nature god. The root glyph would shatter into basic life runes, which I could then guide into my battle chi seed. Fed by continuous spiritual energy, the sprout inside my core would grow rapidly and eventually develop its own source consciousness. When the sprout became true branches and that consciousness became fully integrated and freely controlled, I would reach the 4th rank, Gold Knight. I let out a long breath. Yet another treasure that turned out to be a poisoned gift. But now I knew how to extract the poison and keep the prize. I snapped my eyes open and squeezed the acorn so hard my knuckles turned white. A trap disguised as a gift, becoming a mindless follower of some nature god, able to think but stripped of free will. What good was power if I became a puppet? If the terms had been even slightly reasonable, I might have accepted. Working endlessly for some deity wasn't that different from my old life. But losing my mind entirely? That crossed the line. I shoved the acorn into my soul vessel's ecosystem and activated the refining array. Golden flames, blue water energy, and black and white yin-yang forces poured out and began grinding the acorn down, layer by layer. The root glyph inside started dissolving, releasing tiny points of light that drifted through the space like fireflies. The little spirit insect from the dragon-mouth flower crawled out of its bud and circled the array happily, snatching stray energy particles. Every time it swallowed one, the bumps on its sides grew a fraction larger. The fire sprite saw this and crept out of its hearth to join the chase, darting around with the spirit insect, both of them gobbling up the glowing specks. I caught one of those light points with my spiritual energy and understood instantly. These were the most basic life runes from the druid inheritance, the building blocks, stripped clean of the dangerous connection to the nature god. I gathered them one by one and guided them through my meridians into my battle chi seed. The seed trembled. A tiny bump appeared at the top, like something was trying to push through from inside. I kept feeding it more runes, more energy. A 3rd leaf sprouted, emerald green, joining the red and blue ones already there. 3 leaves swayed in the chi vortex, their colors shimmering together, forming a small halo of light in my core. Then sunlight hit my face. Dawn had arrived. I'd been refining all night without realizing it. I wrapped myself in a blanket from my soul vessel and fell asleep in the chair. Betty's voice woke me. She was outside the door arguing with my guard, trying to bring me breakfast. The attendant was threatening to throw her out if she didn't quiet down. I coughed to let them know I was awake and walked out. She thrust a wooden plate at me with bread she'd made herself, drizzled with honey. Her face was full of hope. I took a bite and asked if she was joining the others to scout attack routes today. She pouted and told me not to change the subject. I told her straight. If she didn't want to participate in the military expedition, she could stay in the castle as a maid, room and board included. Her eyes lit up. She started to ask if she could be something other than a maid, but I cut her off. I already knew what she was thinking, and this was the most I was willing to offer. I told her never to disturb my private time again. She nodded eagerly, unable to stop smiling. I headed for the stairs and found Alina's head poking around the corner. She greeted me and said everyone was waiting for me to eat breakfast. I asked why they'd wait today when they hadn't bothered yesterday. I told her not to bring up borrowing soldiers again. She choked on her words. Then she noticed Betty's beaming face behind me and her expression darkened. She realized Betty had gotten something from me. Alina chased after me, raising her voice deliberately as we reached the hall entrance so the others would hear. She offered to buy soldiers with money, or even more. I turned and faced her directly. I pointed out that they claimed to eat magical beast meat at every meal. By that logic, they should have plenty of proper nights. Why did they need mine? Were my soldiers' lives worth less than theirs? She scrambled to recover, putting on a look of wounded innocence. She claimed they hadn't brought enough guards and were worried that a first battle failure would damage my reputation among the orcs. I told her I didn't care about any of that and walked into the hall for breakfast. Alina grabbed Betty and pulled her aside, demanding to know what I'd agreed to. Betty played innocent, claiming I'd only scolded her for waking me up. Alina didn't believe it and told Betty she'd be leading the vanguard today. Betty protested loudly, asking what idiot designed these battle plans and pointing out that even honorary nobles shouldn't be used as expendable infantry. Alina explained the harsh reality. The Grand Duke was forcing all honorary nobles to participate in the spring campaign. Those assigned to the main expedition army would be leading charges with barely any troops behind them. The orc threat had made the Duke furious, and participation was mandatory. Betty declared she was dropping out. She'd give up her title. She was a maid now, not a noble. Fighting wasn't for her. She'd rather live quietly in a castle, even as a servant. Alina nearly lost her composure. She couldn't believe Betty was throwing away her noble status to become a maid in my household. Betty said it with complete sincerity and zero shame, then dodged past Alina and ran into the dining hall. I heard later that Alina stood there alone, fingers touching the necklace at her throat, the charm necklace. She muttered to herself that she should have used it earlier. Then she composed her face into that practiced smile and walked in. When everyone was seated, I asked Alina about their plans. She was the highest-ranking noble present. She confirmed they wanted to take Riftwind Fortress first. Then she gestured at all the young faces around the table and made one last appeal. Couldn't I see how young they were? These were flowers that hadn't even bloomed yet. Could I truly bear to let them face danger without support? She lowered her eyes shyly when I asked if she was participating too, clearly thinking I was softening. She murmured that of course she'd be there. I nodded and gave them my honest answer. They'd chosen to enjoy the privileges and glory that came with noble titles. They lived in luxury, collected taxes from their lands, and wore their honors proudly. That meant they also had to accept the obligations and responsibilities attached to those titles. A knight's sword wasn't decoration. A noble's crown wasn't jewelry. If they didn't want to fight, the solution was simple: surrender the title, return the lands, and go back to being commoners. Nobody would force a commoner to die on a battlefield. But if they couldn't bear to part with their privileges, their tax income, their special treatment, then they had no right to complain. They'd chosen this road themselves. I stood up, told them to enjoy their meal, and walked out of the hall without looking back. Betty followed me out of the hall, and the looks that trailed after us were a mix of resentment and jealousy. Some hated me for refusing to lend soldiers. Others envied Betty for attaching herself to someone strong. The mood in the room turned heavy and sour. Alina tapped the table and swept her cold gaze across the group. She told them to stop staring and get focused. The original plan had never relied on borrowing my troops. Their own people were supposed to be the main fighting force. They were the strongest fighters available. One of them pushed back, asking if she seriously expected their small group to ambush orcs, the same orcs who could overpower the Empire's regular army. Did she really have a plan? Alina shut him down with a single question. Would he rather join the Grand Duke's expedition army instead? Take orders from high nobles all day, line up, and march into slaughter? That silenced everyone. They all knew that serving in the main force meant being thrown into charges where 9 out of 10 died. At least attacking from here gave them a fallback. If things went wrong, they could run back to my territory and survive. That was the whole point. Alina called them useless, told them to finish eating, and ordered them to move out toward Riftwind Canyon. Without Raymond around, nobody dared argue. They gathered their guards and packed up. Half an hour later, Alina led about 200 or 300 people out of Northwind City. I watched from the attic window as the column disappeared down the road. Betty stood at the doorway below, watching them go too. By noon they reached the canyon entrance and found the wall I'd built blocking the entire passage. Alina's face twitched when she saw it. She looked at the Morning Star banner flying over the nearby fortress and felt a complicated mix of admiration and frustration. She'd known the fortress on the orc side was a stone structure called Riftwind Fortress, but this wall on my side was something I'd built myself. And I'd told them to go to Riftwind Fortress knowing full well this wall was in the way. She sent a guard to fetch whoever was in charge. Thomas came out, backed by over 100 knights. Alina started to scold him, but caught sight of that formation and immediately softened her tone. She asked if his troops would follow her to drive out the orcs, promising to petition for honors on their behalf. Thomas didn't even blink. He told her passage was forbidden. Go back the way you came. A baron named Albert rode forward angrily, demanding to know if Thomas dared block their path. He claimed I had personally sent them to Riftwind Fortress. Thomas hesitated. He looked at the nobles, then at Alina, clearly uncertain. He said he needed to verify because I hadn't informed him about any of this. Alina studied Thomas and privately envied my luck. A man this loyal, this firm, who didn't bend before rank or pressure. In St. Laurent you could search with a lantern and barely find a handful like him. She asked why the wall existed. Thomas explained it was built to defend against the orcs. Good thing it went up in time, because thousands of orcs had attacked during a snowstorm. Nobody had expected them to be crazy enough to assault in heavy winter weather. Alina was stunned. The orcs had attacked here? In a blizzard? Before things could escalate further, a rider galloped up from behind with my orders. I'd sent word to Thomas. Open the breach that the orcs had broken through last time and let them pass. Thomas stared at the group of soft, noble children in disbelief and asked if this was a joke. Alina's lips curled triumphantly. She asked if he still needed to verify. Thomas looked at them like they were walking into their own graves, shook his head, and ordered his builders to start clearing the sealed breach. Some curious nobles rode ahead to watch the work. They saw the ground beneath the cleared ice and went pale. The frozen earth was soaked dark red. Chunks of murky ice still held visible fragments of flesh and shredded beast skin clothing. Nobody knew how many had died there. The young nobles fled back to Alina's side, faces drained of color. Alina asked Thomas about the casualties from the attack. He brushed her off, saying it was none of her concern. Then he turned to a friend and casually mentioned he had fresh red blood ginseng stew waiting back at the fortress. The two of them walked away chatting and laughing without a backward glance. Alina called after him, offering to request his transfer to her service through me. He didn't even turn around. One of her companions tugged her sleeve and said to forget it. Those were all full nights. They couldn't afford to maintain soldiers like that. From the attic window, I watched Alina's group ride off toward the canyon, her back stiff with frustration. I felt nothing. No guilt, no worry, no second thoughts. Betty stood beside me sipping warm milk and asked if I was really not going to help Alina. What if they ran into danger? I told her simply that Alina had to take responsibility for her own choices. Then I called Luke in and asked about White Cloud Harbor. He reported that several piers had been built, enough for 5 ships to dock. Food and weapons were stockpiled, though the last 20 miles of road still required manual carrying since carts couldn't get through yet. I ordered him to send a night squadron to the northern river mouth to establish an outpost. From there, they'd gradually push forces upriver. Betty tried to ask what I was talking about. But I ignored her and continued giving Luke instructions. I told him to send word to Thomas. Open the old breach and let the nobles through. Then I said something that clearly confused Luke. I told him to respect people's destinies and let go of the urge to save everyone. Whether those nobles lived or died had nothing to do with us. Luke didn't understand the philosophy behind my words, but he understood the order. He bowed and turned to leave. Betty was still standing there, refusing to move. Luke grabbed her shoulder and started dragging her out. She protested, insisting I'd only told him to leave, not her. Luke told her that when the master gave an order, everyone obeyed. The consequences of disobeying were serious. She managed one last look at me over her shoulder before Luke pulled her through the door. She glared at him, called him a bad person, and stomped away in a huff. Luke shook his head, paid her no attention, and went to carry out my commands. I sat alone in the attic, closed my eyes, and turned my focus inward. The refining array was still working on the acorn. Life runes continued to drift free, and my battle chi seed was slowly absorbing them. The third leaf on the sprout had grown a fraction larger since last night. Progress was steady. I had a territory to build, enemies to crush, and power to gain. I couldn't afford to waste time playing nursemaid to nobles who'd chosen their own path. If they survived, they'd be useful neighbors. If they didn't, that was the price of the titles they refused to surrender. I lay down and closed my eyes, sending my consciousness into the soul vessel's ecosystem. The refining array blazed with light as I poured spiritual energy and battle chi into it. Torrents of different energies swirled together and hammered the acorn from every direction. It spun endlessly in the current, dissolving piece by piece. Time vanished. When I finally noticed daylight through the window, the acorn was completely gone. Inside the ecosystem, the fire sprite had grown tiny hands and was peeking cautiously from its hearth, watching the empty space where the acorn had been. The dragon-mouth flower spirit insect had sprouted little wings and kept flying back and forth between its bud and the spot where the acorn had dissolved, the bumps on its chest pulsing with excitement. In my core, the battle chi seed floated at the center of the energy vortex. 3 leaves stretched outward, competing for space. Various elemental energies gathered along the main stem, pushing it taller and thicker. Then I heard a crack. The seed's outer shell split again with fine fractures, and a tiny root, chaotic and colorless, trembled its way out through the gap. Joy surged through me, followed immediately by a sliver of frustration. I could feel the next breakthrough was right there, close enough to touch, like a sheet of paper I only needed to poke through. But that paper refused to tear. Not yet. Not quite enough power accumulated. I told myself to be grateful for what I had. Chasing perfection only bred misery. I opened my eyes and pushed the door open. Betty was sitting outside and instantly leaped to her feet, sprinting toward me. She said the attic had been glowing with different colored lights all night long, shining through the windows. She'd been terrified, guarding the door the entire time, wanting to check on me, but afraid to interrupt. I pressed my hand against her forehead and held her at arm's length. I told her to keep her distance and say what she needed to say. She asked if I was hungry since I'd been inside for a full day and night without eating. I checked my body. My core was brimming with battle chi, energy circulating smoothly, and I felt no hunger at all. She tried to reach for my stomach to check, and I pushed her down with one hand. She collapsed flat on the floor, whimpering and playing victim with teary eyes. I warned her seriously. The gap between our strength was enormous. If I couldn't control my force in time, she'd be crushed to paste. She needed to stop getting close without warning. She pouted and called me mud. I didn't argue. Having a lively little maid around wasn't entirely bad. When I eventually brought my parents here to live, she could keep them company and lighten the mood. I turned toward the rising sun, spread my arms, and let the golden warmth wash over me. Then I closed my eyes and checked my morning intelligence. The first squadron of soldiers had landed at the northern river mouth and built an outpost. 1,000 construction workers were following behind them, cutting a road eastward along the riverbank under armed escort. Hachi had been winning battle after battle up north. His bloodline as the former chief's son had won him support from several tribes. The tribal leaders who'd abandoned Kue Luan had met and formally decided to back Hachi as the new orc chief. But Hachi wasn't stupid enough to openly defy me. He remembered how I'd risen to power seemingly overnight. and he feared dying silently without knowing why. So he sent a trusted follower back south with captured goods to report his achievements and prove he was still loyally working for me. Meanwhile, he personally led over 10,000 orcs to trigger avalanches, dig up mountainsides, and block roads, trying to prevent me from pushing further north. The next piece of intelligence was trouble. News about the red blood ginseng had reached the Rain Duchy. The information had spread through St. Lawrence noble circles like wildfire. Grand Duke Stein had sent a griffin squadron to the volcanic reef where the ginseng lived and harvested over 100 specimens. His court mages confirmed that it could rapidly advance blood lineage knights to full knight status. The Duke was desperate to expand his military before spring. He'd already dispatched an envoy heading my way, expected to arrive by noon today. And his private instructions to the envoy were blunt: obtain the ginseng by any means necessary. The final report made me sigh. Alina's group had been amazed by the battlefield wreckage in the canyon. Seeing all the orc remains scattered under the wall, they'd concluded that Riftwind Fortress must be lightly defended now. They'd rushed ahead and reached the eastern canyon exit by yesterday evening. But without my construction workers to dig a path through the snow blockade, they'd had to use their own guards to hack through. The orcs had packed the passage with buried logs that made digging painfully slow and incredibly noisy. The two orc 100-man commanders inside Riftwind Fortress had heard the commotion and assumed a major human attack was coming. They'd immediately sent for reinforcements from Kuei Luan. By noon today, 2,000 orc warriors would arrive to defend the fortress. Alina's group of pampered nobles with a couple hundred lightly armed guards was about to walk into a hornet's nest. I opened my eyes and looked at the sky. The world didn't stop turning just because I was cultivating. Every second I spent sitting still, countless events were unfolding simultaneously beyond my control. Betty was still lying on the floor, staring up at me with wet eyes, asking if I could help her stand. I told her if she wanted to be mud so badly, she could stay on the ground. She huffed. I told her to suit herself. Then I got serious. I told her that her dear sister Alina was walking into danger. She could either go personally or send someone to ask Alina whether she wanted to abandon her plan. This was my last act of goodwill. If Alina ignored the warning, I'd have to notify Steward Edwin to prepare a memorial for her. Because orcs wouldn't treat a delicate young noblewoman kindly, especially one who looked fresh and tender. Betty went white with terror. She scrambled off the floor, hugged her own shoulders, and started shaking. I asked her with a smile whether she planned to warn her dear friend or not. Before she could answer, I called over an attendant and gave him instructions. He was to ride to Seaside Town and tell Edwin that Alina had insisted on leading her group in a loud, clumsy surprise attack against 2,000 orcs. Edwin should prepare for the possibility that the Silver Moon Trading Company's delegation might not make it back. If Edwin wanted to stay in my territory regardless, I'd honor my promise and let him pick a farmstead settlement as his own. Just then, the sky darkened for a moment. I looked up and saw several enormous creatures flying in from the south, beasts that looked like lions with wings, casting huge shadows across the fortress as they passed through the sunlight. Griffins. The Grand Duke's envoy had arrived early. I told my attendant to deliver the message and handle Edwin's farmstead selection on the way. He bowed and left at a run. I watched the griffins circle overhead, their riders scanning my city from above. The Duke wanted my ginseng badly enough to send flying cavalry. This meeting would require careful handling. Giving him nothing would make an enemy. Giving him everything would make me disposable. The answer, as always, lay somewhere in between. Close enough to satisfy, far enough to keep him wanting more. Betty spotted the griffins first, 6 massive shapes sweeping in from the south. She recognized them immediately, reminding me that her father was a count and she wasn't completely ignorant. I told her to come along and went down to meet our visitors. A flashy middle-aged man jumped off the lead griffin before it even fully landed. Snow sprayed everywhere and the wind from the folding wings forced my gate guards to shield their eyes. He smiled broadly and introduced himself as Count Hermann, representing Grand Duke Stein, here to discuss a little business. I didn't smile back. I asked him straight whether he'd come to talk or to steal, since yesterday his people had taken my property without permission. His composure cracked for just a moment. He asked how I could possibly know about that, then waved it off like shooing a fly, saying they'd compensate me if I was willing to negotiate. I led him inside to the sitting room. He settled into his chair and got right to it. The Grand Duke wanted the red blood ginseng badly. Then he dropped his real opening move. He claimed the Reef Islands where the ginseng lived weren't within my territory. From now on, I was forbidden to harvest there. The duchy would manage and distribute the resource centrally. I pushed back immediately. By the duchy's own laws, whoever discovered and developed a resource first owned it. If the Duke could strip my claim today, any noble's territory could be stolen tomorrow using the same logic. Hermann snorted and offered to let me keep 10%. I released my full aura, letting my battle chi pressure flood the room. I told him if he didn't want a fair deal, I was also decent with my fists. His face went pale, his eyes darted around nervously, and he backpedaled so fast he nearly fell off his chair. He stammered about cooperation, not robbery, begging me not to misunderstand. I pulled my pressure back and sat down calmly as if nothing had happened. Hermann wiped sweat from his forehead and tried a different approach. He offered a Viscount title in exchange for the entire reef. I refused instantly. That was a critical resource, not something to sell cheap. He switched tactics again, offering 1 gold coin per ginseng. He pointed out that unranked magical beast meat normally cost far less, and the Duke was being generous because of the ginseng's special properties. I thought about it and agreed, but with 2 conditions. First, any territory I conquered belonged to me. No more nonsense about that. He accepted without argument. Second, I needed flying mounts. Not necessarily magical beasts, just anything that could carry a person through the air. Hermann raised his eyebrows. He said the only properly trained flying mounts were griffins, and those were rare and expensive. He could offer me 1 breeding pair at most, letting me try to raise my own. 2 griffins for an entire ginseng supply seemed deeply unfair. I told him so. He claimed there simply weren't other suitable flying beasts available. I countered that the ginseng only grew in one small area and couldn't be found anywhere else. 2 griffins weren't enough. Hermann insisted that 2 was his limit. Then he let something slip. He said the reef didn't have many ginseng left after their harvest, and nobody knew when the next generation would mature. I started to argue but caught myself just in time. I realized he was trying to bait me into revealing how much ginseng was actually there. I reversed course immediately and expressed concern about overharvesting. If they'd wiped out the breeding population, the resource could be gone forever. Hermann studied me for a long moment, then laughed. He said my composure was remarkable for someone who wasn't even 13 yet. I shrugged and said plenty of people married at 13 or 14. I'd just gotten lucky with a few small achievements. He dropped the reef argument and moved on. If I participated in the spring military campaign against the orcs and proved my capabilities, the Viscount title was mine. I nodded without committing verbally. Then he proposed the core trade. 2 griffins for 1,000 pounds of ginseng. I stopped him immediately. Not 1,000 pounds. 1,000 individual ginseng. Griffins were impressive, but still just second-rank magical beasts. New griffin chicks came up for sale every year from multiple sources. But red blood ginseng existed only in my waters. The supply was uniquely mine. He tried arguing that griffins could reach 3rd or even 4th rank. I asked if he'd actually give me one of those. Of course he wouldn't. The entire duchy only had a handful of high-rank griffins, all reserved for the Duke and his marquises. He accepted the 1,000-piece deal and offered a bonus. For every 5 ginseng, he'd throw in 1 cloud-piercing eagle. These were crossbreeds between cloud sparrows and riftwind eagles, created by the Magic Academy. An interesting failure, he called them. 2 first-rank magical beast parents somehow produced unranked offspring. But the offspring were much larger than either parent and could easily carry a rider. They'd been breeding wild in the eastern mountains for decades, numbering in the hundreds. I liked that deal. Flying scouts and messengers would transform my military capabilities. I told him to be gentle during capture. I didn't want damaged goods. He assured me the Duke valued this trade highly and would guarantee quality. He asked how to deliver them. I pointed him toward the Silver Moon Trading Company's sea route to Seaside Town. Then he asked, almost sheepishly, if he could bring some ginseng back today. The Duke was waiting. I agreed cheerfully. Since he'd shown sincerity, I'd show mine. I told him I was heading to Seaside Town anyway to check on the ginseng harvesting situation. I'd personally select 1,000 of the largest specimens for him to take back. He could have his griffins delivered as soon as possible in return. He practically leaped out of his chair. We set off immediately, my night escort surrounding me as we rode south. Hermann mounted his griffin and flew overhead, following our column. I noticed him looking down at us from above, his expression shifting from pleasant to something colder and more calculating when he thought I couldn't see. I kept my eyes forward but stayed alert. The Duke's envoy had considered ambushing me. I'd felt it in the room when I released my aura. He'd measured my strength against his griffin riders and decided the math didn't work. But that calculation could change if circumstances shifted. As Hermann flew behind my column, I caught the faintest glimpse of his face hardening into something predatory. Then I heard him mutter something to his griffin rider, too faint for anyone on the ground to catch. But I didn't need to hear the exact words. The meaning was clear enough. The Grand Duke's gifts always came with strings attached. Whatever I received today, I'd eventually be expected to pay for many times over. That was how power worked. The strong gave generously until the debt grew large enough to justify taking everything back. I'd accept the griffins and the eagles. I'd sell the ginseng at the agreed price. But I'd never forget that every coin and creature from the Duke came wrapped in invisible chains. My job was to grow strong enough that when those chains finally tightened, I could snap them like thread. I glanced back at the griffins trailing behind my column and kicked my horse into a full gallop. I'd felt the killing intent radiating from Hermann during our meeting. When I'd released my aura and revealed Silver Knight strength, I'd watched him recalculate in real time. Now I wanted to see what he'd do when I made myself a harder target. Through my intelligence later, I learned exactly what happened in the sky above us. One of Hermann's griffin riders had flown close and shouted that we were moving too fast to hit with arrows. Hermann snapped at him to shut up, calling me a titled noble of the duchy who must not be harmed. The rider understood immediately. The Count wasn't refusing to kill me out of principle. He simply lacked confidence in getting a clean kill. Hermann weighed his options carefully. My aura had clearly marked me as a Silver Knight. His griffin archers probably couldn't pierce my defenses. Creating an enemy for nothing would be foolish. He ordered his riders to land and follow on the ground instead, claiming that flying over a lord's territory without permission was disrespectful and could cause misunderstandings. One rider questioned why a count should worry about offending a mere baron. Hermann explained his philosophy coldly. Things done openly became leverage others could use against you. Things done in shadow were the only real moves that mattered. Then he mentioned hearing about a shadow assassin who'd recently arrived at the Adventurers Guild, someone who'd already killed a bronze-rank baron without leaving a trace. He suggested hiring this assassin to handle me quietly. Nobody would know who ordered it. His rider praised the plan eagerly, then made the mistake of asking about claiming my territory afterward. Hermann mocked him viciously. A knight without even a title, dreaming about stealing a lord's land? If the spring campaign succeeded, this territory would become a strategic rear base. Even Hermann himself wouldn't dare touch it then. I filed all of this away for later. Knowing your enemy's plans before they acted was worth more than any weapon. We reached Seaside Town just before sunset. I rode straight to the training camp and asked about today's ginseng harvest. The guards told me Barnes had just delivered the catch and was counting inventory in the warehouse. I gave immediate orders: split the ginseng in half, hide one portion, and bring the rest out to me. Speed was critical. Hermann dismounted his griffin at the camp entrance, stamped feeling back into his frozen feet, and asked with false friendliness why I was standing outside instead of going in. I told him I'd called for the ginseng to be brought out. The open ground here was fine for selecting specimens. My knights came running from the camp carrying wooden buckets, thumping them down in rows. I pulled out a ginseng from one bucket, hefted its weight, and handed it to Hermann. Over a pound each. I mentioned casually that I'd been too generous with previous gifts and should have been more careful about sizes. Hermann examined the golden patterns on the skin, clearly impressed, and thanked me for my generosity. He checked several more from the buckets and nodded approvingly. All of them were large and healthy specimens. I told him to count them. He waved that off, saying there was no rush and he'd count in the morning. That was when I played my card. I told him these ginseng had a critical weakness. Their growing environment was extremely specialized. They couldn't tolerate cold. Sitting out overnight in freezing temperatures would strip away their most valuable properties, reducing them to ordinary nutritional supplements. From the moment they were harvested, there was roughly a 20-hour window before the breakthrough enhancing effects began to fade dramatically or disappear entirely. Herman's face changed instantly. He asked when these had been caught. I called Barnes over. Barnes knelt and reported that harvesting had started at 2 in the afternoon and nets were pulled at 4. That meant the ginseng needed to be consumed before noon tomorrow at the latest. Herman's expression turned urgent. He announced he was leaving tonight. These couldn't wait. They had to reach the Grand Duke as quickly as possible. I offered dinner first, saying a short delay wouldn't matter, but he refused. Every minute counted now. His griffin riders scrambled to tie the wooden buckets to their saddles and harnesses. Herman swung onto his griffin, grabbed the reins, and turned to face me one last time. He promised that the griffins I'd been promised would arrive within 2 days at most. He gave his word as a count. I waved him off. The 6 griffins launched into the darkening sky, circled once over the camp, and flew south, disappearing into the night. I stood at the gate watching them vanish, silent for a long time. The 20-hour claim was true according to my intelligence. The ginseng really did lose its properties outside the volcanic heat. But Herman didn't know I'd already learned this independently. His panic to rush home meant fewer questions about quantities, less time spent snooping around my territory, and maximum pressure on the Duke to deliver those griffins quickly. Everything had worked out perfectly. Jolin appeared at my side. He'd been waiting for the visitors to leave before approaching. He told me to stop staring at the empty sky and started laughing about something. Mother had spent the entire day in the kitchen trying to make me a birthday cake. She kept adding flour and eggs, adjusting and readjusting, and in the end had produced an enormous bread loaf the size of a wash basin. Jolin thought this was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. I didn't laugh. I turned to Barnes, who was still standing nearby, and asked about the ginseng situation. How much was left? How long could we keep harvesting? His answer was sobering. The ginseng were getting harder to catch every day. The ocean temperature was dropping, and the creatures were clustering tighter and tighter around the volcanic vents. The volcano itself seemed to be cooling down too, with less hot water coming out each day. If this continued, the ginseng wouldn't survive much longer in those waters. Jolin grabbed my arm in alarm. If the ginseng disappeared, how would he ever break through to become a proper knight? He hadn't advanced yet. I told Barnes to get back to work, then put my arm around Jolin's shoulder and steered him toward the kitchen. I told him not to let one resource limit his thinking. The red blood ginseng wasn't the only treasure in the world. There were countless others out there. As long as he was willing to go far enough, he'd always find something. Jolin dragged his feet, mourning the ginseng. We'd only had this treasure for a few months, and it was already fading. How could a volcano just cool down like that? I patted his shoulder and told him more good things would come. We just had to keep moving forward. I asked about going to the kitchen to see Mother's creation, and he told me she'd already moved everything to the dining room when she heard I was back. Jolin asked why I wanted to celebrate my birthday and what was the deal with cake. I told him to stop complaining about free food. He admitted he'd heard that the tradition came from dragons. Apparently dragons celebrated their hatching day, and nobles who worshipped dragons copied the custom. Eating cake was supposed to mirror dragons eating their eggshells. I laughed and called the whole thing a bad imitation. I found some flour in the kitchen and started making something of my own. Jolin leaned against the doorframe, watching as I cracked eggs into the flour and began kneading. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was making longevity noodles. He'd never heard of them. Neither had anyone else in this world, obviously, since I brought the idea from my previous life. Flour went everywhere as I worked the dough, kneading it bigger and bigger. Jolin pointed at the growing mass and laughed, saying he was going to tell Mother I was making a mess on purpose. I ignored him and kept working until the dough felt right. Then I told him to boil water. He went to the stove, genuinely curious now. I rolled the dough into a thin sheet, folded it carefully, and sliced it into fine strips. I shook loose a handful, dropped them into the boiling pot, stirred with long chopsticks, added coarse salt when they floated, and scooped them into a large wooden bowl. Jolin followed me to the dining room, where Mother was waiting. She looked confused when I walked in covered in flour, carrying a steaming bowl. I set it in front of her and handed her chopsticks. She took a bite. The noodles were smooth, soft but firm, with just the right amount of salt. She said they were delicious and asked what they were made from. Jolin burst in behind me, proudly announcing he already knew it was flour. He reached for the bowl, but I stopped him. This bowl was for Mother. If he wanted some, he could make his own. He'd already told the kitchen staff to copy what I'd done, so he'd eat soon enough. While Mother ate happily, Jolin nudged me and asked what the story behind longevity noodles was. I kept my voice low, so only he could hear. I told him the day we were born was the most painful day of our mother's life. That kind of suffering was something we could never truly understand. A birthday shouldn't be celebrated as our achievement. It was our mother's day of suffering. On this day, we should make her a bowl of longevity noodles with our own hands, thanking her for the pain she endured to bring us into the world. Besides that, noodles were soft and easy to digest, good for the old and the young alike. Jolin stared at me and asked how I came up with something like this. He whispered that maybe I was a divine messenger, one of those people born with knowledge they shouldn't have. I smiled and told him maybe I was a god walking among mortals. He told me to stop talking nonsense. Father came in carrying the enormous golden brown bread that Mother had baked, dropping it on the table with a thud. He said Mother had made it for me and that she'd spread honey on it. I said it was delicious before even tasting it. Mother scolded me for praising food I hadn't tried yet. I bit into it anyway and told her it was wonderful. We ate together as a family, warm and comfortable. It was the kind of evening I wanted to protect forever. Late that night, I lay in bed listening to waves hitting the shore, thinking about everything that had happened in the past 6 months. When sunlight squeezed through cracks in the wooden walls the next morning, I was officially 13 years old. And I stayed in bed as long as I could, clutching my blanket in a fierce battle between getting up and sleeping more. I compromised by checking my intelligence first. Hermann had reached St. Laurent by dawn and reported everything to the Grand Duke, including his failed plan to ambush me. They decided on a two-pronged approach. First, they'd hire a shadow assassin from the Adventurers Guild to kill me quietly. Second, they'd train the cloud-piercing eagles to respond to a recall command so they could take back the birds whenever they wanted. Give with one hand, steal with the other. The news about Alina was worse. Her group would break through the snow wall by noon today. Following the group's advice, she'd decided to attack Riftwind Fortress at midnight. But 2,000 orcs were waiting in full battle formation. Her force would be crushed and captured. Only a handful of cautious nobles who'd volunteered to guard supplies in the rear would escape. Then something unexpected. Deep inside the ice covering Northwind Fortress, the collision of various magical energies had spontaneously created a spark of spiritual awareness. An ice egg had formed in the frozen depths. When the first thunder of spring cracked across the sky, this egg would most likely hatch into an ice sprite. The sprite's birth would cause the frozen zone around the fortress to keep expanding. The ice egg was already pulling ice element energy toward itself, drawing the magic tide along with it. The original counterattack runes from the ice sealing scroll were breaking down because of this abnormal energy flow. Once those runes failed completely, the magical ice wall would become ordinary ice, vulnerable to melting when spring arrived. But the real prize was this. If I refined the ice egg or the ice sprite, it would perfect my water element battle chi by adding an ice attribute variation. This would push my battle chi seed to grow further. Once it absorbed enough energy and the seed sprouted into a true sapling, I'd break through to the 4th rank. Gold Knight. That was the breakthrough I'd been so close to reaching. The paper-thin barrier I couldn't push through during the acorn refinement. The ice egg could be the final push I needed. I opened my eyes with a cold smile. Hermann and the Duke were smiling to my face while planning daggers for my back. Exactly as expected, I told myself to bring it on. Let me see what this shadow assassin could do against a silver knight who knew he was coming. I got up and pushed open the door. As I was about to step outside, I heard a small dripping sound. I turned and watched an icicle break free from the eaves, fall, and shatter on the ground into pieces. Snow was melting. Spring was coming. The season of growth, of war, and of reckoning. Everything I'd built through the winter was about to be tested. I called for Steward Edwin to come see me. There was business to handle, trades to secure, and preparations to make before the world thawed and everything began moving at once. The peaceful days were ending. What came next would decide whether my morning star kept rising or got swallowed by the storm. I walked down to the docks, boots crunching through melting snow. Edwin came running up behind me, out of breath, bowing as he fell into step beside me. The harbor was busy with ships lined up to unload cargo. I stood at the end of the pier watching the activity and asked how many ships were left. About a dozen, he said. One more day to finish. I asked if he'd thought about the message I'd sent him yesterday, the offer of a farmstead, the option to stay in my territory permanently. He lowered his head and struggled to answer. He apologized but couldn't accept. Generations of loyalty to the Silver Moon family bound him too tightly. I laughed bitterly and asked if it was the usual story about owing a debt of gratitude passed down through the bloodline. He nodded heavily. Then I dropped the hammer. I told him Alina was about to be defeated and killed. His knees buckled instantly. He crashed onto the wooden planks of the pier and begged me to save her, smashing his forehead against the board so hard that blood started running down his face. I looked down at him coldly and asked if this was part of their plan all along. Put themselves in danger deliberately, then wait for me to ride in and rescue them. If that was the scheme, they'd miscalculated badly. I would never send my soldiers to die in a battle that was already lost. He kept slamming his head on the wood, offering all the remaining trade goods, everything on every ship, if I would just save her. I told him this wasn't about goods. From the very beginning, their approach had been wrong. They tried to pressure me with status and control me with resources. Maybe those tactics worked on other people, but I'd recently come into enough wealth that their supplies didn't hold any special leverage over me. Then Edwin's eyes went wild with a sudden thought. He asked about Raymond. Where was Raymond? Only the Soros Viscount could save Alina now. I studied his desperate, blood-smeared face and asked him point-blank whether he was in love with Alina. He denied it frantically, shaking his head so hard drops of blood flew from his forehead. I chopped him on the neck with the edge of my hand. He collapsed unconscious on the pier. I told a guard to carry him back to town and let him rest. My attendant Red had witnessed everything and was puzzled. He told me that when he delivered the warning about Alina yesterday, Edwin had barely reacted, just frowned slightly. Nothing like today's breakdown. I smiled coldly and said that Alina had hidden depths nobody expected. A woman who looked soft and delicate, yet her manipulations ran so deep. I understood what had happened. Edwin's extreme reaction wasn't natural grief. Alina had likely used her charm necklace on him at some point, planting emotional hooks that she could trigger remotely. The man didn't even realize his feelings weren't his own. I sent Red to Riftwind Canyon with orders for Thomas. He was to strengthen defenses and watch for an orc counterattack. More importantly, he needed to be wary of the noble visitors potentially turning hostile if things went wrong. Red was also to find Alina and deliver a warning. War wasn't a game, and the enemy wouldn't follow her script. Through my intelligence, I already knew what was happening at Alina's camp near the canyon's eastern exit. She was sitting in her tent while noble youths argued around her, their voices rising toward shouting. A man named Florian had sent his bonded Skylark, a first-rank magical beast specialized in scouting, over Riftwind Fortress. The bird had circled the fort several times and reported clearly. The fortress was packed with orcs, at least 2,000, crammed into every available space. Several nobles refused to believe him. They argued that the fortress was too small to hold 2,000 troops. The orcs had just suffered a crushing defeat. Both canyon exits were sealed. Why would they reinforce a tiny outpost? It made no sense. One noblewoman in a blue dress accused Florian of fabricating intelligence and told him to come up with something more believable. Florian's face went dark. He told them to believe whatever they wanted. He turned to Alina and said they'd joined this expedition because they trusted her and Raymond's combined strength. With Raymond absent, half their best fighting power was gone. He urged her to either change the attack target or wait for Raymond to return. Alina dismissed his concerns with a gentle but unyielding tone. She told him to keep scouting, but said she simply couldn't believe the orcs would station that many troops in such a small fortress at this point. Florian was furious. He accused her of only believing what she wanted to hear and ignoring his findings completely. Alina held firm. Even without Raymond, she was confident that I wouldn't let dozens of nobles die on my territory. The political consequences would be too severe. The Grand Duke would punish me for allowing it. Therefore, if her attack ran into trouble, my forces behind the wall would surely rush out to help. Florian shook his head and told her she was dangerously naive. He pointed out that I'd risen from horse servant to baron in a single winter. I probably didn't even know which direction the door to the noble council faced, let alone care about the Grand Duke's punishments. Nobody had taught me aristocratic rules because I'd grown too fast for anyone to bother. Alina had no answer for that. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Around noon, A guard came running from the tunnel. They'd broken through. Riftwind Fortress was visible on the other side. The snow outside was untouched, not a single footprint. No patrols on the fortress walls, just firelight flickering inside the structure. The other nobles got excited immediately. They wanted to attack right away while the orcs were unaware. Alina calmed them down. Everyone was exhausted from digging. They needed to sleep first and attack at midnight, when both humans and orcs were at their most vulnerable. A quick strike to kill the orc commanders, seize the fortress, and claim the glory by morning. Florian made one final attempt. He told Alina the orcs were cunning. His Skylark had genuinely seen masses of warriors inside. The empty walls and untouched snow could easily be a deliberate trap to lure them in. Alina cut him off with obvious irritation. She told him if he was scared, he could stay behind and guard the supplies. Florian stared at her for a long time. Then he nodded slowly and said fine. He wouldn't compete with them for glory. He'd stay right here and wait for their good news. His voice was flat, his expression bleak. He turned and walked out of the tent without looking back. He already knew what was coming. He just couldn't stop it. Through my intelligence, I learned every detail of what happened that night at Riftwind Fortress. It played out exactly as I'd been warned. Under cover of darkness, Alina led her 200 fighters through the snow tunnel and out the eastern side. Her best knights, a handful of bronze-rank warriors, crept up to the fortress walls first. They crouched in the shadows and watched for patrols. The walls were empty. Not a single orc guard walking the battlements. They boosted one man up using a thick log. He climbed over, tied a rope to the wall, and dropped it down for the others. Inside the courtyard, a few orcs sat around a campfire, hugging their spiked clubs, snoring loudly. The advance team exchanged nods, slipped to the main gate, lifted the heavy crossbar together, and swung the doors wide open. Alina saw the gates open and pointed her sword forward. 200 people rushed in. The sleeping orcs at the campfire were cut down before they could stand. For a brief, glorious moment, it looked like victory. People started cheering. Someone shouted Alina's name in triumph. The voices grew louder and louder. Then a scream rang out from the wall above. A body tumbled off the battlements and smashed into the ground. Someone shrieked that it was an ambush. Orcs poured out from every direction, from buildings, from behind walls, from underground storage pits, swinging their clubs and roaring. Hundreds of them, then hundreds more. A guard turned to block an attack from his left. A club flew out of the darkness and struck his face. His skull burst apart like an eggshell, spraying red and white across the stones. He swayed once and fell. Panic erupted instantly. People ran in every direction, crashing into each other, screaming. Alina screamed for them to fight their way out. 20 guards charged the gate in a desperate attempt to open an escape route. The first few were swatted into the air by orc clubs, their bodies spinning twice before hitting the ground motionless. Archers couldn't even string their bows before stones from the shadows split their heads open. Within moments, the orcs had split Alina's force into isolated pockets. The survivors looked at the murderous eyes surrounding them and stumbled backward in terror. Then the orcs parted to let someone through. A tall orc rode in on a magic wolf. He was the fortress commander, a 1,000-man captain named Jinshe. He asked who they were and how they'd gotten through from the western side. Alina glanced at her bronze-rank bodyguard. The knight launched himself upward, his sword blazing with golden light, slashing down in a brilliant arc. Jinshe hurled his club at the attacker and yanked his wolf sideways. The beast dodged neatly. Jinshe ordered his troops to kill. Orcs surged from all sides. The remaining guards fought desperately, but were battered down one by one. Alina stood in a pile of corpses, drenched in blood, hair hanging wild. Her sword slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered on the stone. Her legs gave out, and she crumpled onto a body beneath her. Jinshe ordered her bound. Orcs tied her hands behind a wooden pole. 2 of them lifted the pole onto their shoulders and carried her out like a hunted animal. As they passed through the gate, she caught a glimpse of green wings in the corner of her eye. Florian's Skylark, watching from a distance. Anger flickered across her face. He'd been right all along. Back in the canyon, Florian listened to his bird's report with a grim expression. He sighed heavily and turned west without waiting. His guard asked if they should wait for Alina's group. Florian said if she was still alive to blame him later, then she could blame him all she wanted. He walked away without looking back. Behind him, The sounds of battle from Riftwind Fortress grew weaker until they faded to nothing. In Red Maple City, Orc leader Kuei Luin sat in the Count's castle, staring at the doorway. Jinshe marched in and knelt, presenting the bound prisoner. Two orcs carried Alina in on the pole and set her down. Kuei Luin studied the bloody human woman with confusion. He asked Jinshe for a full report. The commander explained proudly that he'd hidden his forces inside the fortress and let the humans walk into the trap. The attackers had been disorganized and few, only 200 or 300. His troops had crushed them in a single charge. This woman was the only survivor. Kuei Luin nodded and asked about casualties. Jinshe reported that only the handful of old and weak orcs placed as bait had been killed. Everyone else could still fight. Kuei Luin exhaled with relief. Then something strange happened. Kuei Luin's eyes suddenly went unfocused. His pupils contracted sharply. He leaped to his feet, battle aura exploding outward, and roared a challenge into the empty hall. Every orc grabbed a weapon and scanned the room frantically. Kuei Luin's gaze swept every corner and finally locked onto the bound woman. He ordered her untied from the pole and set down. He asked if she'd just hit him with some kind of mental attack. She kept her eyes closed and didn't respond. Jinshe grabbed her hair and wrenched her head back. She gasped in pain. Kuei Luin told her to prove her value if she wanted to live. She opened her eyes and told him he'd better release her. She claimed to be Viscountess Alina, and that the Baron who'd been crushing his forces all winter was funded by her Silver Moon family. Kuei Luin was stunned. A Baron had been doing all that damage? Alina explained that his title was Baron, but his actual strength was enormous, with over 1,000 formal knights under his command. Kuei Luin asked the obvious question. If this Baron was that powerful, why hadn't he attacked? Why had he watched her walk into a death trap without lifting a finger? Alina couldn't answer. Kuei Luin grabbed her throat and squeezed slowly. He asked why she alone had survived when his warriors killed everything in their path during Blood Frenzy. How exactly had she stayed alive? As she choked, Jinshe stepped forward with hungry eyes fixed on her body. He asked if the chief didn't want her. Could he have her instead? Other orc officers in the hall were staring too, their fierce expressions melting into something glazed and entranced. Kuei Luin noticed it immediately. Every orc near the woman had lost their predatory edge. Their eyes had gone soft and dreamy. Even Jinshe, a hardened killer, was practically drooling. Something was deeply wrong. Kuei Luin smashed his fist into Alina's temple. She went limp instantly, knocked unconscious. He turned back to Jinshe and asked what he'd just said. Jinshe dropped to his knees, terrified, apologizing for coveting the chief's woman. Kuei Luin watched his officers' faces slowly clear, the unnatural haze draining away, their normal savage expressions returning. He understood now. Magic. His eyes found the blue gemstone necklace hanging around Alina's neck. He reached down and ripped it off in one sharp motion. The charm necklace. The weapon she'd been planning to use on me. Instead, it had saved her life among the orcs, and simultaneously revealed exactly what kind of person she truly was. Through my intelligence, I learned what happened to Alina after she was captured. Kuei Luin sat in Red Maple City's castle, examining the charm necklace he'd ripped from her throat. The blue gemstone flickered in the firelight like a half-closed eye, radiating subtle enchantment. His commander Jinshe stood nearby, still staring at the unconscious Alina with glazed, hungry eyes, throat bobbing as he swallowed. He asked what the necklace was. Kuei Luin glanced at him and asked if he wanted to hold her. Jinshe lowered his head, ashamed but unable to deny it. Kuei Luin laughed and said humans had a phrase for this, binding yourself in your own silk. Since Alina had used magic to manipulate his warriors, he'd let her suffer the consequences. He ordered her dragged away and given to his men, telling them to line up and enjoy themselves. The necklace's lingering enchantment had warped their desires, and he saw no reason to fight it. Let them work it out of their systems. Several orcs grabbed Alina and carried her off. Jinshe followed her the entire way. Kuei Luin waved him away too, telling them all to have their fun. Then he sat alone, crushed one of the necklace's gemstones between his fingers, and watched the powder fall through his grip. He muttered about how pathetic she was. No real strength, just tricks and manipulation. Then his thoughts turned to me. A baron. The person who'd killed thousands of his warriors, who'd outsmarted him at every turn, was just a baron. He took that as a personal insult. He called in a 100-man captain named Chagang. The orc stumbled and still dazed from the necklace's residual effects, asking if he could cut in line for his turn with Alina. Kuei Luan slapped him to the floor and ordered him to take a squad into Riftwind Canyon to check whether my wall was still standing and whether there was any opportunity to attack. Chagang understood eventually, though he still begged to visit Alina first. Kuei Luan told him to go cut in line quickly, then get moving. Chagang ran off shouting for Jin Che to let him skip ahead. Kuei Luan shook his head and picked the necklace back up, turning it over in his hands while staring at the flames. I woke before dawn, worried about the situation. My intelligence confirmed everything I'd feared and more. George had stumbled into a cave deep in Dragon Coil Mountain and was exploring inside. Raymond had waited for him, but lost patience. He planned to return to Seaside Town today without having found his half-brother. Alina had walked straight into the trap exactly as predicted. Her entire force was wiped out. She was the only survivor, kept alive because the charm necklace had enchanted the orcs into wanting her rather than killing her. When she'd faced Kuei Luan, she'd burned through the necklace's remaining power trying to control him directly. He was too strong-willed. He ripped it off and handed her over to his soldiers as punishment. Kuei Luan was now desperate. Spring was coming. The duchy's army would gather soon. He'd sent Chagang to scout the canyon for another attack opportunity. Steward Edwin had finally broken free from the necklace's lingering influence. His consciousness had been in chaos, replaying every unnatural decision he'd made while under Alina's spell. He remembered that his family had been sacrificed for the Silver Moon Trading Company long ago. With the enchantment shattered, he'd chosen to stay and serve me instead. The ice egg inside Northwind Fortress had begun stirring. The sealing magic's runes would collapse within 3 days. When they did, the escaping energy tide could help ordinary people develop ice-type bloodlines. And the Griffins Hermon had promised would arrive at Seaside Town by this evening, fully trained and ready to ride. I sighed about Alina. I'd thought she was a clever noblewoman with real political skills. Turns out everything she'd accomplished was built on a magical trinket that manipulated people's emotions. Every negotiation, every alliance, every loyal follower, all of it poisoned by artificial charm. Edwin, Raymond, probably dozens of others over the years. None of them had ever liked or respected her by genuine choice. I pulled the blanket over my head and went back to sleep. Winter was for growing taller and resting. I couldn't fix everyone's problems. The sun climbed high before Mother yanked the covers off me. She said Betty had come looking for me, claiming to be my maid and offering to take care of my daily needs. Mother seemed amused by the whole thing. She said the girl wore her heart completely on her face and had zero noble arrogance. She asked if I consider her seriously. I deflected and told Mother she should focus on finding someone for Jolan first, or he'd accuse her of playing favorites with her younger son. She scoffed and said he wouldn't dare. I got dressed and told her I wanted to move the family to Northwind City. The stone walls were thick and warm, unlike these drafty wooden buildings by the sea. She refused, saying she and Father were comfortable here with Jolan. I tried explaining about the coming energy tide that could grant ice bloodlines, which would give them strength to protect themselves even when I wasn't around. She declined again. She said they were too old for that kind of change. And if Jolan got any stronger, he'd start wandering off on adventures, and she couldn't bear both sons being away from home. I gave up and suggested they at least move to the Black Pine Baronial Keep inland. The coastal humidity wasn't good for their health long-term. She agreed to that. Betty popped her head through the door and reported that she'd spotted Raymond arriving. I told her to send him to the sitting room. I had news for him. She slammed the door and ran off immediately. Mother watched her go with a soft smile and said the girl was genuinely nice. Then she looked back at me, and for just a moment, something complicated flickered behind her eyes. I didn't notice. I was already thinking about my next moves. The ice egg, the griffins, the orc scout heading into my canyon, the spring campaign drawing closer every day. What I didn't know, what I completely failed to see, was that Mother had figured everything out long ago. She knew I wasn't her real son. She'd known since the day the original Alan was knocked unconscious by a wild boar in the forest and came back different. The sudden changes in behavior, the impossible knowledge, the way I spoke and thought. A mother notices these things even when the whole world is fooled. She'd chosen to pretend. Every single day, she'd chosen to act like nothing had changed. She smiled at the stranger wearing her child's face because she was terrified that if she ever said the truth out loud, even this fragile connection would shatter. She'd lose not just her real son, but also the protection and care this new person provided. Late at night, alone in her room, she cried. Every night. Then she dried her tears and faced the morning with the same warm expression, gambling everything on the hope that whatever had taken her boy's place still had enough kindness to keep calling her mother and keep this family safe. I walked away thinking she was just a simple woman from a backward world who didn't notice details. I was completely wrong about that. She saw everything. She just loved enough to stay silent. I walked into the sitting room and found Raymond staring blankly at a cup of tea, looking completely lost. I sat down across from him and asked if he'd failed to find George. He sighed heavily and said he'd waited for days on Dragon Coil Mountain without seeing a single trace of the boy. George had apparently fled deep into the canyons and never came out. He asked if he could just pay to have the problem disappear. He was done pretending to care about a half-brother he'd never wanted. I told him 1 gold coin would settle it. He nearly fell out of his chair. Last time I joked about charging extra, and now the price was practically nothing. I explained he'd already paid with the rainbow swan eggs. I told him I could guarantee he'd never see George again, but there would be no body to inspect. He thought about it and agreed. As long as George didn't cause problems for the Soros family, whether he lived or died was irrelevant. Then I shifted to the real topic. I told him I had news about Alina. His brow furrowed, and an uneasy look crossed his face. He asked me to tell him she was fine. I told him she was alive. How long she'd stay that way was uncertain. She'd been captured by orcs after launching a reckless night attack on Riftwind Fortress. Raymond shot to his feet, so fast his chair crashed over backward. He grabbed the table edge, swaying, looking disoriented. Then he slowly righted his chair and sat back down, pressing his hand against his forehead. He said he felt dizzy. Something strange was happening inside his head. He asked me to repeat what I'd said. I told him again, calmly, watching his every reaction with careful attention. He exhaled slowly and stared into space. He asked why she'd been so careless and whether I'd tried to warn her. I said I had, but she was a viscountess surrounded by people who agreed with everything she said. She hadn't wanted to listen to a baron. Then came the reaction I'd been waiting for. Raymond shook his head and said he felt hollow inside, like something had been ripped out of him. His mind was foggy. He couldn't think clearly. I understood exactly what was happening. Alina's charm necklace had been destroyed or taken from her on the orc side. The artificial emotional bond it had created in Raymond was dissolving. Years of manufactured feelings were evaporating in real time, leaving behind nothing but confusion and emptiness. I tested him directly. I told him Alina might die. Didn't he want to save her? He looked at me with genuine bewilderment in his eyes and asked why he would do that. The response confirmed everything. The enchantment was gone. Without the necklace's influence, Raymond had no natural desire to risk his life for her. Whatever he'd felt for years had been fabricated by magic, not born from his heart. I laughed out loud. He asked what was so funny. I waved it off and changed the subject, asking who had designed the plan to attack the orcs with only 200 or 300 people. He frowned and tried to remember. He said it was Alina. She'd claimed she had a way to make me send troops to support them. Then he looked up at me and asked why I hadn't sent anyone. I asked him one more time if he truly didn't want to rescue Alina. He shook his head slowly, still looking dazed. He said his mind was completely blank. He couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. I stood up, walked over, and patted his shoulder. I told him nothing was wrong that sleep couldn't fix. If one night wasn't enough, he should try 3 days and 3 nights. He nodded weakly and headed for the door. Halfway there he stopped and said he was planning to leave tomorrow. He couldn't even remember why he'd agreed to come to the north in the first place. His own territory had piles of unfinished business waiting for him. I watched his hunched back disappear through the doorway. For the first time, I felt genuine desire for a magical item. That charm necklace was terrifyingly powerful. It could make someone devote years of their life to a person they didn't actually care about, and they'd never even suspect they'd been manipulated. Betty shoved her face into my field of vision, asking what I was looking at, and insisting I should look at her instead because she was prettier. I pushed her head aside and asked if she knew about Alina's magical items. She said of course she did, and that they weren't rare at all. Every family above Count rank owned at least a few. Most were flashy but useless. Alina had a storage ring with her personal seal and some contracts inside, but nothing else special. I asked about magical items in general. Betty explained that the Magic Academy produced very few each year, and the Grand Duke took most of them to equip his Knight Corps. Whatever leaked onto the open market was absurdly expensive. Even the Silver Moon family, with all their wealth, only possessed a handful of inherited pieces. Ordinary nobles had almost no chance of obtaining any. I suddenly asked Betty if she felt anything unusual today, physically or mentally. She thought about it carefully and said no. Just that the wooden house was cold and she wanted to live in a stone castle. Good. The charm necklace's destruction hadn't affected her. Either she'd never been close enough to Alina when it was activated, or her own emotional simplicity had protected her. I thought about the necklace's limitations. It only worked on the opposite sex, had no effect on the same gender, and its power was significantly reduced against people with strong willpower. A single-purpose tool, essentially, boosting romantic attraction toward the wearer. Useful for manipulation, but narrow in application. That evening, sharp cries split the sky. 7 griffins appeared from the south, circling and screeching above the training camp. My knights poured out and surrounded the landing zone. The lead rider announced they were delivering griffins for me. 5 of the 7 were their own mounts. The remaining 2 were chained, my payment from Hermann's deal. I asked why mine were restrained. The rider explained nervously that while they were trained, they still needed bonding with a new rider. If they flew off before that happened, there'd be no getting them back. I told him to start the handover. My soldiers took the chains. The delivery riders didn't even wait for pleasantries. They leaped onto their own griffins and flew south immediately, almost like they were fleeing. The moment they disappeared over the horizon, I felt a rush of wind behind me. Both chained griffins were beating their wings furiously, trying to break free and follow their flock south. So that was the trick. The delivery riders had left quickly on purpose, hoping the 2 griffins would instinctively chase after them and escape before I could react. My knights grabbed the chains and held on. I launched myself into the air, landed on the first griffin's back, and punched it square on the skull. It collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, wings drooping, whimpering pathetically. The second griffin screamed in terror and thrashed even harder. A chain link snapped with a metallic ping. I kicked off the fallen griffin, flew upward, and brought my fist down on the second one's head mid-flight. It seized up instantly and dropped from the air like a stone. My knights erupted in cheering. I landed, dusted off my hands, and looked at the 2 griffins cowering on the ground with their heads tucked low, all their earlier defiance completely beaten out of them. I waited for the noise to die down, then gave my order. Take 1 drop of blood from each griffin's claw, and pull 1 tail feather from each. Those were what I needed to begin the soul blood binding process. These birds were mine now, no matter what recall tricks Hermann had planned. I took the small vials of griffin's soul blood from my attendant and pulled them into my soul vessel. Betty's eyes went wide. She started asking about storage rings and tried grabbing at my sleeves to find one. I pushed her away and told her to learn some boundaries. She retreated with a pout, twisting the hem of her shirt between her fingers. I ordered the knights to take the griffins to the training camp, feed them well, and begin taking turns riding them. We needed to start building experience for a future flying unit. The knights hauled the 2 dazed beasts away by their chains. Betty bounced back immediately, marveling that I now owned griffins when even her family didn't have any. She begged me to take her flying. I told her she wasn't even a knight yet. So what was the point of going up there except to freeze? She chased after me, insisting she was close to breaking through and that a few more red blood ginseng would push her over the edge. I stopped walking and turned to face her. I told her she could eat as much ginseng as she wanted. Tomorrow I was heading to Northwind City where an energy tide was forming. I could give her 1 chance to advance. But if she couldn't keep up with me, that was her problem. She clenched her fists and swore she could do it. I shook my head and told her not to celebrate too early. I was about to break through to 4th-rank Gold Knight. She hadn't even reached 1st-rank Black Iron. Did she seriously think she could keep pace with me? Her lip trembled and tears welled up. I told her to rest and be ready to leave at dawn. Then I walked away without looking back. Behind me, I heard her crying as she ran off. Back in my room, I fed the griffin's soul blood into the forest python's soul pearl inside my vessel. The connection snapped into place immediately, clear and strong. I could sense both griffins now, feel their heartbeats, their fear, their slowly returning consciousness. I smiled at the possibilities. Between these griffins and whatever other beasts I could bind, building a magical creature unit wasn't just a dream anymore. The wind howled outside like someone weeping. I lay down and fell asleep quickly. Before dawn the next morning, I checked my intelligence while still in bed. The reports were waiting. Alina was dead. After what the orcs had done to her, her body and spirit had both been destroyed. She'd closed her eyes permanently at dawn. The orcs threw her remains into a cooking pot. Only her skull survived, kept by Commander Jean Shea as a trophy. I stared at that report for a long moment. She'd brought it on herself with that necklace, manipulating everyone around her, playing games she didn't have the strength to back up. But still, nobody deserved that ending. The orc scout Shagang had spent a full day probing the western side of Riftwind Canyon. He'd confirmed my defenses were solid and had retreated. The orcs were now reinforcing the eastern exit instead of planning another attack. George was still wandering deeper into a cave system on Dragon Coil Mountain. He'd found nothing valuable but refused to turn back, convinced there was something worth discovering further inside. Herman was organizing the capture of cloud-piercing eagles. The first batch would arrive in about 10 days. Meanwhile, a griffin squad would come to Seaside Town this evening to collect another shipment of ginseng. The shadow assassin had accepted the contract on my life. He planned to infiltrate a merchant ship and sail directly to Seaside Town. His rank was second-tier Bronze Knight. His weapon was a magical cloak that let him melt into shadows for short periods. He'd killed at least 3 nobles and had never failed a job. I almost laughed. A bronze-rank assassin sent to kill a silver knight who was about to become gold? Herman and the Duke were either cheap or stupid. Probably both. I was genuinely disappointed. I'd expected something more challenging. I rode hard for Northwind City with my guards and arrived by noon. Standing in the attic of the Viscount's keep, I gazed at the glowing blue ice wall of the sealed fortress. I asked Luke about finding administrative talent. He lowered his head, sweating. I sighed and told him to start training people himself. I couldn't afford to have nobody who could do basic accounting a few years from now. Then I told him the ice seal was about to break. I needed people monitoring it constantly. The moment the magic failed completely, I wanted to know. 2 days passed. When scouts confirmed the magical runes had fully collapsed, I ordered soldiers to start chipping away at the ice from the south side. But watching them struggle with the thick frozen wall, I remembered what the intelligence had said about the ice egg hidden inside. I climbed the wall myself, scaling the frozen surface all the way to the top of the fortress. I followed my senses to where the ice element energy was densest and sat down cross-legged. I closed my eyes and extended my spiritual energy outward, wrapping it around the surrounding ice elements. Inside my core, the blue leaf trembled gently. Then a massive suction force erupted from within me. Ice energy from every direction transformed into thin blue threads of light, streaming through my pores, flooding my meridians, and pouring into my core. The blue leaf guided the ice energy, merging it with my battle chi, splitting it apart, merging it again. My water attribute power gained a sharp, biting edge of cold that hadn't been there before. A new variation. Ice within water. Day turned to night, turned to day again. I lost track of time completely. Energy kept flowing in without stopping. As I drained the ice elements from the fortress, massive cracks spread across the outer walls. Chunks of ice broke loose and crashed to the ground below. Then it happened. A sound like thunder detonating inside my soul. My battle chi seed trembled violently and then erupted. The 3-leaf sprout exploded with growth. 3 slender branches shot upward in seconds, each sprouting fresh leaves that swayed in the energy currents of my core. The tiny roots that had barely poked through the seed shell burst outward in every direction, drilling into every corner of my core space. The seed's outer shell and the surrounding chi vortex were consumed instantly, absorbed and converted into pure energy that fed the rapidly growing sapling. Hunger hit me like a wave. My body demanded more. I instinctively pushed my spiritual reach further outward, pulling denser energy from greater distances. Visible streams of blue power spiraled around me and poured into my body. The cycle fed itself. More reach meant more energy, meant more growth, meant more reach. When dawn broke, a tremendous surge of joy flooded my consciousness. A shock wave of energy burst from my body and rippled outward in every direction. Then something strange happened. I could suddenly see everything around me simultaneously, from every angle at once. I looked down and found my arms had become branches, my legs were roots. Before panic could set in, my vision snapped back to normal. But the omnidirectional awareness remained. I could feel every corner of my body with perfect clarity. I realized it was the sapling's perspective. The tree growing in my core had developed its own form of perception, and I could access it. I started switching between my physical eyes and the tree's awareness, back and forth, fascinated by the difference. Gradually, as my spiritual energy seeped deeper into every fiber of the sapling, the two perspectives merged completely. I could use both simultaneously, two overlapping views that didn't interfere with each other, controllable at will. I was now a fourth-rank gold knight. The breakthrough was complete. I shook my head and sighed. Everyone around me was still stuck at first rank. I didn't even have anyone to compare notes with. Being this far ahead of everyone in my territory was useful for survival, but it made for a lonely path. With my new gold knight perception, I looked down through the ice beneath my feet and saw clearly what lay 10 meters below. A small hollow space filled with flowing elemental energy, and at its center, a pale blue ice egg floating silently. Ice elements streamed in from every direction, feeding into the cavity, nourishing the egg drop by drop. Suddenly, a wave of hostile consciousness hit me from inside the egg. It was trying to scare me off. I laughed. The thing hadn't even been born yet, and it was already threatening people. Not a great start to our relationship. I pulled my star-patterned sword from my soul vessel and filled it with battle chi. The blade erupted with blue light, humming with power. I stabbed downward. The sword's energy pierced through the ice, but only left a thin cut on the surface. This stuff was incredibly dense. I tried again, harder. Same result. The ice was too thick for simple stabbing. I changed tactics. I carved a square outline into the ice with the sword's energy edge, then gathered battle chi into my left fist and punched the center. The block shattered perfectly. I swept the fragments into my storage space with spiritual energy and jumped into the hole. Then I kept cutting, block by block. What I could slice cleanly I stored whole. Awkward angles got smashed and collected as chips. 2 hours of relentless cutting later, I'd isolated the entire cavity from the surrounding ice wall. I reached in and touched the shell protecting the egg. A wave of fear and pleading washed over me from inside. No, please no. I ignored it and pulled the whole thing into my soul vessel's ecosystem. The instant the egg vanished, the ice fortress began falling apart. Without the egg's gravitational pull holding the ice elements together, the energy scattered wildly. Blue streams of power dispersed into the air and vanished. Cracks spread through the walls. Chunks of ice started breaking loose everywhere. I wrapped my entire body in battle chi, kicked off the crumbling surface, and launched myself through the air. I landed on Northwind City's wall in a flash of blue light. When I turned around to look, the ice fragments I'd launched were still falling from where I'd been standing moments ago. Flying felt wonderful. I called over a squad of guards and told them the fortress was fully unsealed now. They needed to clear the passage of remaining ice as quickly as possible. They ran off to spread the word. Looking down from the wall, I noticed something interesting among the construction workers chipping away at the base. Several of them had started radiating faint cold energy from their bodies. The escaping energy tide was giving ordinary people ice-type bloodlines, just as my intelligence had predicted. So this was how the first generation of extraordinary beings had accidentally gained their powers. The magic tide simply washed over them and changed their bodies. I checked my own soldiers and saw they were absorbing energy rapidly, their strength visibly increasing. But their bloodlines weren't changing. The tide could elevate normal humans to extraordinary status, but those who already had power through my soul blood system seemed to be locked into their existing path. The soul blood gave them a shortcut to strength, but it also created a ceiling. They could never exceed the level of the magical beast whose essence powered their abilities. That was the trade-off. I'd given them the chance to change their fates. Going higher was their own problem. I flew back to the Viscount's keep, landed on the attic walkway, told my guards not to disturb me, and sat down cross-legged inside. My spiritual energy sank into the soul vessel's ecosystem. I activated both the refining array and the binding array. Dense patterns of magical script wrapped around the ice egg like an invisible net. The egg shook violently, sending out distressed consciousness pulses. Please, no, stop. I soothed it with gentle thoughts and told it to behave. The arrays ground forward, yin-yang energy swirling around the egg alongside my battle chi. The struggling weakened. The consciousness grew quieter. After another hour of refinement, cracks appeared across the egg's surface. Then the top burst open. A tiny blue head poked out, with bright, curious eyes scanning everything around it. "Master, are you there?" a small voice asked. "I'm here," I answered through consciousness. The spirit creature squeaked in terror and dove back inside the egg. Its eyes pressed against the shell wall, looking around frantically. After a long wait with nothing threatening appearing, it cautiously emerged again. "Are you Master? Where are you? Whenever you call, I can't hear you." It ducked back inside, then peeked out again. Back in, out, back in, out. It turned this into a game, and I played along patiently, answering every single call. Then it started eating its own eggshell. Within minutes, the entire egg was gone. The tiny creature wriggled, opened its mouth, and breathed out a puff of frost. Ice spread across its body, forming a blue cocoon. Moments later, the cocoon exploded. A thumb-sized figure burst out, fluttering translucent wings. She was entirely blue, with clear features, 2 tiny braids, and a miniature dress made of crystallized ice. "Master, keep me away from that thing." She pointed angrily at the fire hearth where the flame sprite lived. "It's disgusting." "You're disgusting." The flame sprite erupted from its hearth, fire flaring up dramatically before shrinking back down. "Fight me if you dare." "You?" The ice sprite snorted contemptuously. She waved her hand, and the scattered eggshell fragments flew back together, forming a tiny blue spear in her grip. She pointed it at the flame sprite. "Prepare to die. Master, save me." The flame sprite bolted from its hearth and fled at full speed. The ice sprite chased it, jabbing her spear repeatedly. The 2 thumb-sized creatures zoomed around the ecosystem space, one fleeing in panic while the other attacked with gleeful fury. My heart practically melted watching them. I separated them with a thought, moving each to opposite ends of the space and placing the dragon-mouth flower spirit insect in the neutral middle ground. Water and fire, natural opposites. They'd just have to learn to coexist. Then my soul vessel began shaking violently. With all 3 spirit creatures now established in the ecosystem, radiating their elemental essences, the vessel responded by surging with power. The storage space inflated like a balloon, expanding over 100 times its original size. The ecosystem grew proportionally, with wider horizons and higher skies. The vessel's hull deepened in color, and the soul banner at the bow began trailing wisps of blue energy. I felt the new capabilities flowing through me and couldn't contain my excitement. In just a few days I'd broken through to Gold Knight, and my soul vessel had advanced to 3rd rank. The power increases were stacking on top of each other beautifully. The ice sprite sat on a crystal of ice in her new territory, hugging her knees, face buried in her arms. She called out to me in a small, pitiful voice, saying the sudden expansion had frightened her. I told her not to worry, to focus on growing, and to get bigger and stronger quickly. She pouted, glanced up once, then buried her face again and sulked quietly. Even her pouting was adorable. I stepped out of the attic after finishing my cultivation session. My guards dropped to their knees to greet me, but before the first word left their mouths, a crossbow bolt came screaming out of the shadows at the stairway corner, aimed straight at my face. Blue light erupted across my body. I reached out calmly and caught the bolt between 2 fingers without flinching. My guards drew swords instantly, surrounding me in a protective ring, scanning for the attacker. I pointed toward the stairway. 2 guards crept over in defensive stances and stabbed into the space below. Nothing there. They called out that it was empty. But through my new Gold Knight perception, the tree vision that let me see from every angle simultaneously, I could clearly see a man in a black cloak pressed flat against the wall in the shadow between the stairs and the stone. He was less than 3 feet from my guards. Their sword tips had practically brushed his nose. He didn't even flinch. His mouth actually curled into a mocking smirk. So this was the famous shadow assassin, the one who'd killed 3 nobles without ever being caught. His magical shadow cloak let him merge with darkness and become completely invisible. My guards had walked past him multiple times without detecting anything. Against ordinary opponents, that trick would be lethal. Against me, it was pathetic. I flicked my wrist. The bolt I'd caught shot from my fingers like a dart. It punched clean through his chest. His eyes went wide with disbelief. He looked down at the bolt sticking out of his body, knees buckled, and he collapsed out of the shadows into plain view. My guards nearly jumped out of their skin. 1 second the space was empty. The next a bleeding man appeared out of thin air. They recovered quickly and drove their swords into him without hesitation. His expression shifted from vicious to pained to bitter as he slumped face down on the floor, motionless. I shook my head and started walking toward the stairs. This was what happened when someone relied entirely on a single magical tool. Take away the cloak's advantage, and he was just a mediocre bronze rank fighter who had no business attacking a gold knight. Completely reckless. I told my guards to drag the body away and chop it up. 2 of them grabbed the corpse and waited for me to pass before moving it. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, the supposedly dead body lunged upward. A pitch-black dagger slid from the assassin's sleeve, stabbing toward my chest in one final desperate strike. I extended my palm. Blue battle chi exploded outward from my hand, hitting the dagger and the man behind it with a blast of freezing cold. Ice spread across his body in an instant, locking him in a crystalline sculpture. Dagger extended, face twisted in fury, frozen mid-thrust. I looked at the ice statue for a moment and nodded to myself. The ice ability worked beautifully. Then I punched it. The ice sculpture exploded into thousands of tiny fragments. Crystals of ice mixed with pulverized flesh scattered across the floor like glittering snow. Nothing recognizable remained. Not a finger, not a tooth. Complete destruction. I glanced at the melting mess with contempt and walked downstairs without another thought. The great shadow assassin who'd never failed a contract had just been erased in under 30 seconds. Hermann and the Duke had wasted their money. In the great hall, the squad captains had heard the commotion upstairs. They were kneeling in rows when I entered, foreheads pressed to the stone floor, nobody daring to breathe loudly. I sat down in the main chair and asked about the fortress. The passage through the ice had been cleared. The remaining areas still needed work, but the road was open. I stood up and looked across the kneeling officers. The time for defense was over. I announced that starting immediately, night squadrons would rotate accompanying me on a northern campaign. Every orc territory would be taken. Those who earned enough merit would receive fiefdoms as their reward. The hall went silent for 1 heartbeat. Then it erupted. The roar of cheering shook the walls. Every face blazed with hunger for land, for titles, for a future they could build with their own hands. I gave out specific orders. Oleg would take the 4th Night Squadron through the fortress passage immediately to assess conditions on the other side and locate Slave 1's mapping team. He was to bring Slave 1 back to me personally. Einar would lead a battalion plus 2,000 construction workers ahead to build forward camps and secure key mountain passes. Everyone else was to prepare. Tomorrow, we marched north together. They acknowledged each command with thundering voices and scattered to execute. The energy in the room was electric. These men had spent months building walls, enduring cold, and fighting defensive battles. Now they were finally being unleashed. I strode out of the hall and immediately heard the patter of small running feet behind me. Betty came sprinting around a corner calling my name. She slammed face first into a dome of blue light surrounding my body and bounced backward, clutching her forehead. She asked what that was. I told her it was battle chi armor, a protective barrier formed by condensing chi around the body. She stared at me with enormous eyes and asked if I'd reached Gold Knight rank. I turned the question around and asked her to describe the strongest person she'd ever seen. She said it was her father, a Silver Knight. He could barely coat his weapons with battle chi, let alone form a full protective shell. In combat, he relied almost entirely on physical strength and actual metal armor. The fact that I'd previously been able to maintain chi on my weapons for extended periods had already seemed impossible to her. I asked about anyone stronger. She said she'd heard the Grand Duke's inner circle included Gold Knights, but she'd never met one personally. I asked about mages and magical combat. Betty told me that most magic in their world was used for support and utility, not direct fighting. Battle magic was considered weak and impractical. Nobody had imagined magic could produce the kind of devastating power that had sealed the entire fortress in ice until they'd seen it with their own eyes. I patted her head gently and told her never to underestimate magic. Knights fought with visible, physical force that could be blocked and countered. But magic could kill dozens of people with a single small spell. One scroll had frozen an entire fortress. What level would a knight need to reach to accomplish the same thing? She immediately declared she would protect me from magical threats. She announced proudly that she'd broken through to Black Iron Knight, thanks to the energy tide, and could now officially claim the small fief her father had reserved for her. She'd raise soldiers and help me fight orcs. I told her sure, whatever made her happy. Then I asked what bloodline she'd awakened. She looked down shyly and said she wasn't sure what it was exactly. It looked like a fox, but it had 3 tails. A 3-tailed fox. That was actually a remarkable bloodline with serious growth potential. I told her she'd gotten lucky and that if she trained hard, she'd surpass her father someday. She asked what my bloodline was. I pushed her head aside and told her grown-up matters weren't for children to ask about. She huffed and reminded me that she was actually older than me. I was only 13. If anyone here was the child, it was me. I kept walking and didn't look back. Behind me, I could hear her stomping her feet in frustration before running to catch up again. Before dawn, over 3,000 soldiers stood assembled at the castle gates. Every pair of eyes burned with the same hunger, merit, land, a chance to remake their lives. I stood on the wall above them, blue battle chi erupting from my body like a pillar of flame reaching toward the sky. I drew my sword and pointed it north. March! 3,000 voices roared back at me. The sound crashed between the walls and echoed across the valley. The night squadrons charged first, hooves hammering the frozen ground, spraying mud and ice behind them. Infantry followed in tight formation. The column moved through Northwind Fortress's cleared passage in good order. I turned east and spread my arms toward the rising sun, letting the first warmth of early spring wash over me. Then I closed my eyes and checked my morning intelligence. Kuei Luan had discovered that his own people had betrayed him. The tribal leaders had abandoned him and thrown their support behind Hachi. But instead of racing north to fight for his throne, Kuei Luan had made a different choice. He'd cut off his own retreat and committed everything to fortifying Red Maple City. He planned to make his final stand there against any human army, buying time for the orc race's future. He'd accepted death. Hachi, meanwhile, had panicked. He couldn't defeat Kuei Luan quickly, and he was terrified I'd summon him back now that spring had arrived. Even more, he feared I'd discover the full scope of his ambitions. So he'd grabbed his followers and fled north as fast as possible, abandoning captured human slaves and heavy supplies along the road to move faster. Back in St. Laurent, things had gotten complicated. Alina's life token, a magical marker kept by her family, had shattered, confirming her death. Combined with Raymond returning home in a confused daze, the Silver Moon Marquis had accused me of murdering Alina and dozens of noble youths. He'd wept before the Grand Duke, demanding military retaliation and claiming my territory as compensation. The Duke ultimately rejected the Marquis's demands, but privately he was pressuring the Adventurers Guild to hurry the Shadow Assassin along. He wanted me dead quickly so he could absorb my forces before the Spring Orc campaign. The assassin was already a frozen pile of fragments on my attic floor, but they didn't know that yet. The final piece of intelligence was fascinating. The orc priest Sahalian had reached the orcs' ancestral homeland ahead of Hachi and unearthed an ancient magical ship from deep underground. The vessel was built from unknown wood that had survived 1,000 years without rotting, though it had suffered considerable damage. Sahalian had used magical plants and spirit insects collected during his journey to repair the hull, feeding the ship's dormant spirit with elemental essence, trying to wake it from its millennium-long sleep. I stared at the rising sun and thought about what all of this meant. People talked about outsiders being untrustworthy, but members of the same race betrayed each other just as eagerly. The only reliable way to maintain order was through overwhelming force. Kill enough enemies, and the survivors learned to cooperate. I dropped from the wall onto my horse's back in a flash of light. One kick and the stallion reared, hoofs pawing the air. I shouted the order to move and rode north with my guards flanking me. The passage through the fortress was rough, hastily chopped ice and flowing meltwater. I rode through without slowing. The moment I emerged from the northern side, a vast mountain valley spread before me, stretching toward distant peaks under a pale blue sky. I reined in my horse and took it all in. Mountains meant everything in a world of supernatural power. Plains could only grow food. Mountains held, or magical beasts, rare herbs, and hidden treasures. The real wealth was always buried inside the peaks. A territory with plains, but no mountains, was crippled from birth. A squad of riders galloped toward me from the northeast. The lead figure was tall and broad, an orc. At 100 paces out, he threw away his weapon, jumped off his horse, and ran the rest of the distance on foot, dropping to his knees before me. "Master, your most loyal slave 1 reports for duty." I looked down at him from my saddle. I asked where slave 2 was, that stubborn little creature who'd never accepted the name I gave him properly. Slave 1 started hammering his forehead against the ground. Blood broke through the skin almost immediately, mixing with mud and smearing across his face. He begged forgiveness. Hachi had betrayed me. He'd taken thousands of orcs and fled north, claiming he was conquering more territory in my name. But he'd blocked the mountain passes behind him with avalanches and rubble, preventing anyone from following. I scoffed. Blocked roads? This was a world of supernatural power. A few piles of rocks couldn't stop anyone worth worrying about. I asked how many people remained in the valley. Slave 1 reported about 300 elderly and weak orcs. No surviving human settlements had been found in the immediate area. Good. Very good. Hachi thought he could run from his mistakes. He was wrong about that. I told Slave 1 to lead the way and ordered the pursuit. 2 hours later, we reached the mountain pass that Hachi had blocked. My construction workers and soldiers were already picking at the rubble. I told everyone to stand clear. Blue battle chi exploded from my body. I launched into the air, rising 40 feet above the blocked passage. From up there I could see exactly how the debris was packed. I dropped back down, gathered ice and cold energy from every direction into my palm. The elements swirled together, condensing into a brilliant blue sphere that grew denser and colder by the second, radiating killing frost and blinding light. I shoved the sphere forward with both hands. It screamed through the air like a cannon shot. Everything in its path dissolved. Rocks melted. Ice vaporized. The sphere carved a deep trench through the entire blockage, boring straight through to the other side. When the dust settled, a perfectly round tunnel 5 meters wide stood open before us. The inner walls were smooth as glass, coated in a thin layer of blue ice, gleaming like a corridor built by craftsmen rather than blasted by force. My soldiers went wild with cheering. I flew back onto my horse, pointed forward, and gave one word. Chase. The knights surged through the tunnel first. 3,000 soldiers followed, pouring through the mountain pass and spreading into the northern territories beyond. Along the way, we gathered 3,000 to 5,000 abandoned human slaves, emaciated, barely alive, dumped on the roadside by Hachi's fleeing horde. We killed a few dozen stragglers who'd fallen behind the main orc column. By nightfall, we made camp. I'd spent the ride staring at bleached bones scattered along the trail. So many dead. I called Slave 1 to my tent. He knelt before me, shaking violently. I told him the world never ran short of fools who overestimated themselves. But some jobs still needed doing. He swore he'd do anything I commanded. I told him his race's survival depended on his performance. He was the first orc I'd bound, and his strength had grown faster than any other. Whether his people continued to exist was now entirely in his hands. Then I gave him his mission. Take his orc soldiers and pursue Hachi. But do not kill him. Drive him. Herd him like a frightened animal, pushing him further and further north. Let Hachi drag more orcs along in his panicked flight. Let him explore unknown lands and discover new territories, all while running from Slave 1's pursuit. I laughed at the beautiful simplicity of it. Hachi would become my unwitting explorer, charting the north while thinking he was escaping. And the moment he stopped being useful, no matter where he hid, I could destroy his soul instantly through the blood bond. Slave 1's pupils shrank to pinpoints. His whole body trembled. I told him I disliked making threats. I hoped he would always remember what he'd witnessed, the absolute power I held over every soul-bound servant. For loyal dogs, I permitted continued existence. He smashed his head against the ground 3 times, thanked me, and backed out of the tent. Within the hour, he'd assembled his orc soldiers and vanished into the northern darkness, chasing Hachi's trail through the mountains. Through my intelligence, I learned everything about the chaos unfolding among Hachi's fleeing horde. After blocking both southern passes with rubble and avalanches, Hachi had kept pushing north without stopping. He dumped massive amounts of plundered goods along the trail to move faster. But once they crossed into Orc homeland territory and he still kept running, his followers started getting angry. Several tribal leaders who'd only joined him out of convenience gathered together and confronted him. A second-rank warrior named Fulin demanded to know why they were still fleeing. Both southern routes were sealed. Were they supposed to starve in the mountains? They'd abandoned most of their supplies and all their human slaves. Who was going to farm for them now? Were mighty Orc warriors supposed to dig in the dirt themselves? Hachi tried intimidating Fulin with a cold stare, but it didn't work. Another leader named Borgi stepped in to smooth things over, but the damage was done. One by one, the tribal leaders released their battle auras, 7 or 8 second-rank warriors projecting their power simultaneously, pressing down on Hachi like an invisible mountain. Hachi's body trembled. His face went white. He was only a first-rank Black Iron fighter. He'd won these leaders' loyalty through his father's bloodline and reputation, not through personal strength. Any single one of these tribal chiefs could beat him in a straight fight. All of them together could crush him without breaking a sweat. He asked what they wanted. They pulled back their pressure and claimed they just felt bad about all the abandoned treasure. Nothing personal. Hachi made a quick calculation and offered a deal. Anyone who wanted to follow him should drop everything heavy and move faster. Anyone who'd rather go back for the discarded goods was free to do so. Just bring him 20% of whatever they recovered once everyone reunited at the ancestral lands. The leaders jumped at the offer immediately. 20% was nothing compared to the mountains of supplies scattered along the trail behind them. One after another they volunteered to stay behind and collect the goods. For them, picking up free treasure and maybe fighting some humans was far more appealing than running through frozen mountains with empty hands following a leader they didn't respect. Then a scout came sprinting into camp, face white with terror. He reported that my soldiers were coming, and coming fast. Hachi's face drained of color. He stammered that it was impossible. How could anyone move through mountain terrain this quickly in early spring when the ice was barely melting? Borgi grabbed the scout by the collar and said the same thing. It shouldn't be possible unless every single soldier had supernatural abilities. The scout confirmed exactly that. Every one of my troops was at minimum a trainee knight with extraordinary physical capabilities. At their current pace, they'd catch up by tomorrow. Hachi snapped at the scout for calling me master in front of the tribal leaders. The scout had been one of his original Orc slaves, and old habits died hard. Hachi couldn't afford to let these proud warriors know he'd once been a collared servant. The leaders demanded a decision. Fight or run. Hachi went quiet, his eyes darting around while his mind raced. Then he suddenly burst into laughter. He told them they'd all been fooled. Yes, my forces were strong at the bottom level. But apart from me personally, my best fighters were only first-rank knights. Every tribal leader present was second-rank. They outclassed my soldiers individually. What was there to fear? The leaders perked up at this. Fulin practically bounced with eagerness, asking if they should turn around and attack. Hachi said yes, and they should strike at the heart, meaning me. But inside, Hachi was terrified. He knew exactly what I could do. Every time he thought about tribesmen dropping dead silently with no visible cause, he felt ice crawling up his spine. The soul-blood bond meant I could kill him with a thought, anywhere, anytime. No distance was far enough. Then Hachi played his real card. He sighed dramatically and said that since he was only first rank while they were all second-rank warriors, he wanted to share power with them. He offered to distribute authority among the tribal leaders. Their eyes lit up with greed simultaneously. Serving under Hachi was one thing. Holding real power themselves was something else entirely. They knelt and declared their willingness to share his burden. Hachi spelled out the arrangement. They would set up an ambush and wait for my forces. If they could kill me in one decisive strike, he would split half his authority with them. Shared rule, equal power. The leaders fell over themselves accepting. Then came the twist. Hachi announced he wouldn't be joining the ambush himself. He was heading north to the ancestral territory. He left the camp, the supplies, and the fight entirely in their hands. The leaders were stunned. Fulin asked why Hachi wasn't staying. Hachi patted his shoulder, said he was counting on them, and walked out of the tent without looking back. He mounted a horse, gathered his 400 or 500 loyal followers, and galloped north into the darkness. The remaining leaders stared at each other in confused silence. Feline scratched his head and asked what had gotten into their chief. When Hachi had attacked weaker orc tribes, he'd been fearless and aggressive. But the moment my name came up, he ran like a rabbit. Borgi thought about it and guessed that being captured and enslaved by humans had left deep psychological scars. They'd all seen what happened to human slaves under orc control. If I had done something similar to Hachi, or worse, something that went beyond physical abuse, it would explain his bone-deep terror. One leader said he felt uneasy about how quickly Hachi had fled. Something didn't add up. Another leader with yellow teeth and meat stuck between them announced he didn't care about strategy right now. He wanted to eat roasted human legs. He argued that eating well would help them move faster for tomorrow's ambush. Borgi glared at him, but couldn't argue with the logic. Feline made the decision. He ordered all remaining human slaves slaughtered for food and all stored alcohol distributed to the troops. Eat their fill tonight, fight tomorrow. The camp erupted in cheering, followed shortly by screaming as the slaves were dragged to the fires. From a distance, riding north under the dark sky, Hachi heard the faint sounds drifting from the camp behind him. Screams, laughter, cursing, all mixed together. One of his followers started to ask about the people they'd left behind. Hachi cut him off. Keep moving. This grudge just got much deeper. He gripped his reins tighter, a single thought spinning through his head. I wouldn't spare any of them. Not one. He knew that with absolute certainty. But he couldn't save them, and he couldn't stop them. All he could do was run, as far and as fast as his horse would carry him. He kicked his mount harder and didn't look back again. Through my intelligence, I learned exactly how the night raid played out while I slept in my camp further south. Slave 1 led his orc soldiers through the darkness and reached the enemy camp in the dead of night. They crawled up behind a ridge overlooking the sprawling encampment below. Hundreds of orcs lay scattered around dying campfires, drunk on stolen wine and gorged on human flesh. Most were passed out cold, sprawled in every direction. Slave 1 told his men to rest for 1 hour, then they'd go in. He reminded them of orc combat traditions. No mercy, no hesitation. While they chewed dry rations, he talked about something that clearly weighed on his mind. He told them I'd already granted him a small fief. It wasn't big, but it was enough for one person to live comfortably. If they performed well in this mission, with so many mountain peaks unclaimed, I might reward more of them with land too. No more cramped barracks. Each man could become a small landowner. One of his soldiers asked the question they were all thinking. Would I really trust orcs with land? Would human settlers accept orc neighbors? Slave 1 shook his head and told them they weren't seeing the full picture. He said that to me, they were currently dead weight. Their strength couldn't keep up with my advancement. The same was true for my human soldiers, honestly. Everyone was falling behind. Then he shared something unexpected. He said he'd heard an old tribal prophecy from a priest long ago. The seer had described a future where this land was peaceful, where different intelligent races lived side by side. But the ruler who created that peace eventually left because the local resources could no longer help him grow stronger. Slave 1 had figured out what it meant. I would expand outward eventually. It was inevitable. And when I did, they couldn't follow. Their job was to earn enough merit now to secure a place in that peaceful future, land where their children could grow up without war. His soldiers repeated those words quietly. For their children to grow up. The fear in their eyes was replaced by something harder, something willing to pay any price. One orc gripped his club and said he'd give his life for that. Slave 1 stood, crouched low, and pointed toward the camp. Tonight's objective was to drive the enemy north, not kill them all, just chase them away. Those were my orders. No pursuit afterward. They'd rest here for half a day tomorrow morning. He cut off questions before they started. Don't ask why. Just follow the plan. They spread out and approached from 3 sides. A spark popped from a campfire and landed on a sleeping orc, who jumped up yelping and stomping. He stepped on the orc next to him. A fight broke out. One of the brawlers suddenly noticed dozens of gleaming eyes watching from the darkness beyond the firelight. Slave 1 charged. 200 orc soldiers hit the camp from 3 directions simultaneously, clubs swinging, war cries splitting the night air. The 2 fighting orcs never even turned around before Slave 1's clubs smashed them both apart, spraying blood and organs across the frozen ground. The orc slaves tore through the camp with brutal efficiency. Every swing killed. Sleeping orcs died before they could open their eyes. The sounds of shattering bone and tearing flesh filled the air. In his tent, the tribal leader Borgi woke to the noise. He grabbed his weapon, peeked through the tent flap, and saw unknown orc warriors rampaging through the camp with first-rank combat skills. He didn't recognize a single one. That meant these weren't local fighters. They had to be orc slaves serving a human master, just like Hachi's original soldiers. Which meant humans had caught up. Borgi didn't shout a warning. He sliced open the back of his tent with a knife and ran barefoot into the night. Another leader, named Fulin, stumbled out of his tent just in time to see Borgi scrambling away on all fours toward the north. Fulin didn't need an explanation. If Borgi was running, the situation was hopeless. He turned and ran too. Every surviving orc who saw their leaders fleeing followed without question. Within 30 minutes, the entire camp was empty except for trembling human slaves and a handful of orcs who'd surrendered on their knees. Slave 1's soldiers tied up the prisoners and ignored the terrified slaves. Then one of his men called him over to the campfire, voice shaking. He pointed at a pile of bones scattered carelessly around the ashes. Human bones, leg bones, arm bones, cracked open for marrow. The remains of the slaves those orc leaders had butchered and eaten for their pre-battle feast. Slave 1 picked up bone after bone, his face growing darker with each one, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He said something that surprised me when I read the report. He said orcs were supposed to be intelligent beings, not wild animals. Eating humans would make them enemies of every thinking race in the world. He paced back and forth by the fire, unable to form a complete sentence. His soldiers gathered around, asking what to do. He stopped and looked north at the black sky. All he could say was that he hoped I wouldn't blame them for what others of their kind had done. Then he told them to find food, cook something proper, and eat before dawn. They spent the rest of the night cleaning up corpses and sorting through abandoned supplies. When I woke that morning and checked my intelligence, I couldn't help grinning. The full picture was exactly as I planned. Hachi had panicked the moment he learned my forces were close. He'd bribed the tribal leaders with promises of shared power, tricked them into staying behind as a shield, and fled north with only his closest followers. Those leaders had been too greedy and too proud to see they were being used as sacrificial pawns. Then Slave 1's night raid had scattered them before they could even set up their ambush. Borgi and Fulin were now running north in disarray, chasing after Hachi without knowing he'd already abandoned them. The whole orc power structure was fragmenting, with each group pushing further into unknown territory, mapping lands I'd never seen, blazing trails I'd eventually follow. The first batch of 50 cloud-piercing eagles had been loaded onto ships and would arrive at Seaside Town in 3 days. They were too small to carry heavy riders before reaching first rank, but they could manage lightweight scouts. Not combat-ready yet, but useful for reconnaissance and messaging. Hermann hadn't come personally with the delivery. He was still waiting to hear from his shadow assassin, the one currently decorating my attic floor as a puddle of melted ice and pulp. I laughed to myself as I climbed out of my bedroll. Run, Hachi. Run as far as you can. The world is enormous, and I need someone to draw my maps. Every step you take in terror is another mile of territory charted for my future empire. Keep running. Keep exploring. And when you finally stop being useful, you already know what happens next. I called Luke into my tent first thing in the morning and told him to notify Oleg immediately. Finish breakfast and move out. The 4th Night Squadron needed to take over the camp that Slave 1 had captured overnight, and Slave 1's troops needed to keep chasing the fleeing orcs north. Luke found Oleg squatting by a campfire with his squad leaders, slurping porridge and swapping stories like they had all the time in the world. Luke didn't waste a second on pleasantries. He told Oleg the sun was already up and he hadn't even assembled his men. Did he want to impress me with his speed, or did he want me to come over and personally kick him into action? Oleg's face went pale. He leaned close and whispered to Luke, asking if I was angry about the slow pace. Luke just nodded and jerked his chin northward, reminding Oleg that his job was to serve as the army's vanguard. Was he seriously expecting me to clear the path for him? Oleg started sweating and immediately started screaming for his knights to mount up. He gave them 1/4 hour to assemble, threatening 10 lashes for anyone who showed up late. Then he galloped north without looking back. I watched him go from my tent entrance and shook my head. Real talent was 1 in 10,000. Most people could only grow so far before hitting their ceiling. Oleg was competent enough for the tasks I gave him, but he'd never be more than that. An hour later, Oleg's squadron reached the captured orc camp. Slave 1 was sitting on a rock by the gate, half asleep, gnawing on dry rations. He heard the hoofbeats, jumped up ready for a fight, then relaxed when he saw my red Morning Star banner. Oleg asked whether Slave 1 planned to rest or continue the pursuit. Slave 1 smiled bitterly and pointed at his exhausted troops, who could barely stand without swaying. They'd marched dozens of miles through mountains yesterday, then fought a midnight battle. Every one of them was running on empty. Oleg leaned close and dropped his voice. He warned Slave 1 that I'd be arriving soon. How would it look if Slave 1 was just sitting here waiting? Would I see a loyal commander resting his troops, or a lazy subordinate dragging his feet? Slave 1 could decide for himself which impression he wanted to make. Then Oleg rode on without waiting for an answer. Slave 1 stood there watching the dust settle, jaw working silently. After a long pause, he picked up his club and told his men to forget about resting. They were moving out. Now, his soldiers groaned and staggered upright, barely conscious, following the horse tracks north on wobbling legs. One of them mumbled that they hadn't slept all night. Slave 1 told him that being tired didn't matter. They had no choice. If they wanted to live, they had to keep proving their worth with every step. The mountain paths grew narrower and rougher. The columns stretched thinner as weaker soldiers fell behind. Far ahead, Hachi had run through most of the night before finally stopping at dawn to make a crude camp. He'd barely managed a few sips of hot broth when the sound of running feet echoed from the south. Growing louder, coming fast. He burst out of his tent and squinted toward the noise. It was Borgi and Feline's groups, the tribal leaders he'd left behind as sacrificial shields. They were supposed to be setting up an ambush and fighting my forces. Instead, they were running for their lives. For 1 second, Hachi felt relief at seeing familiar faces. Then his stomach dropped. If these leaders were fleeing, it meant my soldiers had already smashed through their positions. The ambush had failed before it even began. His buffer was gone. Nothing stood between me and him now. He grabbed the nearest horse and swung into the saddle without a word. This part ends here, but the story continues on our Patreon if you don't want to wait. Also, if you're enjoying this manhwa recap, give the video a like and leave a comment. And subscribe if you want to see the next parts on the channel.